Somewhere in the American heartland, just across the river from what is now St. Louis, Missouri, there is a field. It is a wide, grassy field in the state of Illinois. Unremarkable to anyone driving past on the highway, the kind of place most people pass without a second glance. But if you stop, if you actually pull over and walk into that field and look carefully, you begin to notice things. The ground is not flat. It rises and falls in patterns that are too regular, too deliberate to be natural. There are hills here that should not exist. Mounds of earth rising from the floodplain with a geometry that the Mississippi River did not create. The largest of them stands nearly 100 feet tall. It covers 14 acres at its base, more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Beneath your feet, in the soil and the buried layers of human history, lies the story of a city that defies almost everything we think we know about ancient North America. This was Cahokia. And it should not have existed. Not in the way we think about civilization. Not in the time period we assume the continent was home to nothing more than scattered hunter-gatherer bands and small farming villages. Because Cahokia was a genuine city, a metropolis by any reasonable definition of the word. At its height, somewhere around the year 1100 of the Common Era, it was home to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people living within its core, with tens of thousands more in the surrounding settlements and satellite communities that stretched across the floodplain in every direction. It was, at that moment in time, one of the largest cities in the entire world. It was larger than London. It was comparable to contemporary cities in Europe and Asia that we consider the birthplaces of great civilizations. It was a city with monumental architecture, a city with a planned urban grid, a city with long-distance trade networks stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. A city with politics, with religion, with hierarchy and inequality, and the full complicated tangle of what it means for human beings to live together in large numbers. And then it was gone. Not slowly, not in the gradual, grinding way that most ancient cities decline. Cahokia's disappearance has a quality to it that archaeologists still struggle to fully explain. The city that took perhaps a generation to reach its peak took several more generations to empty out, and by sometime around 1350 of the Common Era, the people who had built the greatest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico had simply walked away from it. The mounds remained, the plazas remained, the post holes and the fire pits and the buried objects remained, but the people were gone. And for the next 2.5 centuries, until European explorers arrived in the region, the site stood essentially empty, its meaning forgotten by the time anyone thought to ask. This is the Cahokia paradox, the largest city in pre-Columbian North America, a place of genuine urban sophistication and cultural complexity, rose with breathtaking speed, dominated a continent-wide web of influence and exchange, and then vanished so completely that when the first European settlers arrived in the Mississippi River Valley, they found only mounds, great earthen mounds of mysterious origin, so far beyond what they assumed the indigenous peoples of the continent were capable of building that they invented phantom civilizations to explain them. The mound builder myth, as historians call it, invented lost tribes of Israelites and wandering Welsh princes and ancient Egyptians to account for what was sitting right in front of them, because it was easier to imagine impossible visitors than to accept that the people already living in North America had built something so extraordinary. Tonight, we are going to rebuild Cahokia from the ground up. We are going to walk through its streets in the year 1100, feel the weight of the city around us, smell the smoke from its fires, and hear the sounds of tens of thousands of people living their lives in one of the most remarkable urban experiments in human history. And then we are going to watch it unravel, layer by layer, season by season, until the last family gathers their belongings and walks out of the Grand Plaza for the last time, into a future we can only partially trace. We are going to sit with the mystery of what happened, consider every theory that historians and archaeologists and climatologists have proposed, and at the end of it, we are going to arrive at the honest and somewhat unsettling truth that we do not fully know, that Cahokia holds its deepest secret still, and that the not knowing is itself one of the most profound things this vanished city has to teach us. Before we begin, I want to say something to you. Whether you found this video in the middle of the day, looking for a long documentary to lose yourself in, or whether it is late and the room around you is dark and quiet, and you are letting history carry you towards sleep, you are exactly the person I make these videos for. The past deserves slow, careful telling. It deserves the kind of attention we give it when the world gets quiet. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it now? Let us begin at the beginning, which is not with Cahokia at all, but with the land that made Cahokia possible. There is a place in the American Midwest where geography conspires to create abundance on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend from the outside. It is called the American Bottom, and it is exactly what the name suggests. The bottom, the lowest elevation, the broad, flat floodplain that runs along the eastern bank of the Mississippi River for roughly 120 miles in what is now southern Illinois. The river here is wide and ancient, having carved its course through the soft limestone and sandstone of the interior lowlands over millions of years. The floodplain it created is some of the richest agricultural land on the continent. The soil is deep and dark, replenished every few years by floods that deposit fresh sediment from the vast watershed of the continent's interior. The Missouri River joins the Mississippi just a few miles to the north. The Illinois River joins from the northeast. The Cahokia joins from the south. The confluence of these waterways created a hub of connectivity that had no equal in the interior of the continent, a natural crossroads where anything moving along any of the great river systems of central North America would eventually pass. This geography shaped everything about what would eventually happen here. The rivers were highways. They were the interstate system of the pre-Columbian world, broad and navigable, capable of carrying people and goods across distances that would have been nearly impossible on land. A canoe paddled down the Illinois River would reach the Mississippi and could then turn south toward the Gulf Coast or north toward the Great Lakes. Trade goods moving east to west could follow the Missouri out toward the plains, or move northeast into the Ohio River Valley, and from there toward the Atlantic watershed. Cahokia's future location was not an accident. It was the natural center of a continental web, the single place where more threads of geography converged than anywhere else in the interior of North America. The floodplain itself was a landscape of extraordinary biological productivity. Before the construction of modern levees and the draining of the wetlands for agriculture, the American bottom was a mosaic of habitats that supported an almost bewildering diversity of plant and animal life. Backwater lakes and oxbow ponds teemed with fish and waterfowl. The bottomland forests of cottonwood and willow and silver maple provided mast and browse. The uplands that bordered the floodplain were covered in oak and hickory forest, rich with nuts and game. The prairies to the east offered bison and other large mammals. The rivers themselves were full of catfish and sturgeon and freshwater mussels. For a people who lived by what the land directly provided, the American bottom was as close to paradise as the continent offered. You could feed a very large number of people from a relatively small area, which is one of the prerequisites for urban life anywhere in the world. The story of human habitation in the American bottom goes back at least 12,000 years, to the end of the last ice age, when the first people crossed or spread into the interior of the continent. But the story that leads directly to Cahokia begins considerably later, in what archaeologists call the woodland period, which runs very roughly from about 500 BCE to 1000 CE in this part of the world. The woodland cultures of the eastern woodlands were not simple or primitive in any meaningful sense. They built burial mounds, they maintained long-distance trade networks, they produced sophisticated ceramic art, they understood agriculture well enough to cultivate certain plants, even if farming was not yet the dominant mode of subsistence. The most famous of the woodland cultures is called Hopewell, named for a farm in Ohio where some of the most remarkable archaeological sites were found. The Hopewell people, who were active roughly from about 100 BCE to 500 CE, built enormous geometric earthworks, maintained trade networks spanning half the continent, and created stunning artistic objects from materials that could only have come from far away. Obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from the Lake Superior region, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, shells from the Gulf Coast. The Hopewell network connected communities across thousands of miles in a web of ritual exchange that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. The American Bottom was part of this network, and the communities living there participated in the exchange of ideas and goods and probably people that kept it alive. But Hopewell declined, for reasons that are, themselves, not fully understood, sometime around 500 CE. The great earthwork ceremonial centers were abandoned, the long-distance trade networks contracted or reorganized. The archaeology of the period between roughly 500 and 900 CE in the American Bottom is considerably less dramatic than what came before and what would come after. Communities persisted. People farmed and hunted and fished and buried their dead. But the kind of monumental ambition that had characterized Hopewell seemed to be absent from the landscape. The American Bottom was a place of many small communities, probably organized at the level of the village and the extended kin group, without any overarching political structure to unite them. And then something changed. The change happened fast. In archaeological terms, catastrophically fast. Archaeologists call the period that begins around 900 or 950 CE the emergent Mississippian period, and during these decades, the seeds of something extraordinary were being planted across a wide area of the eastern half of North America. Communities began to adopt maize agriculture at a more intensive level than ever before. The cultivation of corn, which had been present in eastern North America for centuries, but had never been the primary food source, suddenly became the foundation of subsistence across a huge geographic area. The caloric productivity of maize allowed communities to support larger populations per unit of land than any previous agricultural strategy in the region. Village sizes grew, social complexity increased. The organizational structures needed to coordinate larger groups of people began to emerge. In the American Bottom, specifically, a distinct cultural tradition was taking shape that archaeologists would eventually call Mississippian. The Mississippian people built their largest structures as platform mounds, flat-topped earthen pyramids that supported temples and elite residences. They organized their communities around open plazas. They developed a distinctive ceramic tradition featuring shell-tempered pottery. They built palisade walls around their most important centers. And they were organized, politically and socially, in ways that were more hierarchical, more centralized, more complex than anything that had preceded them in the interior of North America. The emergent Mississippian communities of the American Bottom were already larger and more complex than anything in the region's archaeological past by the time the 10th century CE ended. But they were still villages, substantial villages with real complexity and real social hierarchy, but villages nonetheless. The plaza, at the center of a major emergent Mississippian settlement, might have covered an acre or two. The mounds were modest. The population numbered in the hundreds, perhaps a few thousand if you included all the satellite hamlets within a day's walk. None of that prepares you for what happened next. Sometime around the year 1050 CE, something happened in the American Bottom that has no clear parallel anywhere else in the pre-Columbian history of North America. Archaeologists call it the Cahokia Big Bang, and the name, borrowed from cosmology, is not entirely metaphorical. In the span of what appears to have been a single human generation, perhaps even less, a cluster of emergent Mississippian villages in the American Bottom underwent a transformation so rapid and so complete that it looks less like gradual cultural development and more like a revolution. A capital city appeared. The evidence for the speed of this transformation comes from decades of patient archaeological work, from the analysis of pottery sequences and radiocarbon dates, and the stratigraphy of soil layers built up over centuries. What archaeologists have been able to establish is that the early 11th century CE saw an explosion of construction activity at the site we now call Cahokia that compressed what might normally take several generations into a very short period. The Grand Plaza at the center of the site was leveled, scraped flat, and maintained as an open ceremonial space, covering approximately 190 acres, the equivalent of more than 30 modern city blocks. The mounds began to rise, not one at a time over long periods, but apparently in a burst of coordinated construction that involved the movement of millions of cubic feet of earth by people working with nothing but wooden tools, woven baskets, and their own bodies. The largest of these mounds, the one that European Americans would eventually call Monk's Mound, because a group of Trappist monks farmed its terraces in the early 19th century, was by itself one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the history of pre-Columbian North America. It was built in stages, but the core of its construction was already underway in the early 11th century. When it was complete, it would stand approximately 100 feet tall, with a base covering 14 acres and a total volume of about 22 million cubic feet of earth. Every cubic foot of that earth was carried by a human being, a basket load at a time, from the borrow pits that surrounded the mound to the rising summit. The sheer labor involved is staggering to contemplate. It has been estimated that if you mobilized every adult in a city of 10,000 people and put them to work carrying earth for 8 hours a day, the construction of Monk's Mound as it exists would still take years to complete. And Monk's Mound was not alone. The city contained more than 120 other mounds of varying sizes, each of them requiring enormous labor, each of them representing a conscious architectural choice about how the city should look and how it should function. What drove this explosion? What caused a collection of emergent Mississippian villages to suddenly become a metropolis? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. But there are several factors that archaeologists believe converged at precisely the right moment to make the Cahokia Big Bang possible. One of them is the geography we have already discussed, the extraordinary natural abundance of the American bottom that could support a large population. Another is the intensification of maize agriculture, which was reaching its maximum productive potential in the region at exactly this time, providing the caloric foundation for a large sedentary population. A third factor is a period of favorable climate, the medieval warm period, a global climatic shift toward warmer and wetter conditions that lasted from roughly 950 to 1250 CE, meant longer growing seasons and more reliable rainfall across much of the interior of North America, boosting agricultural productivity and allowing communities to support larger populations with less risk of catastrophic failure. But these factors explain why a large city could exist in the American bottom. They do not fully explain why one appeared with such extraordinary speed. For that, many archaeologists point to the role of charismatic, religious, and political authority. The Cahokia Big Bang looks, in its archaeological signature, like the work of a movement, a new religious or political ideology, perhaps centered on a specific leader or a specific set of beliefs about the cosmos and humanity's relationship to it, seems to have swept through the communities of the American bottom with enough force to mobilize labor on a scale that had never been seen before. The construction of the city was not, archaeologists believe, primarily driven by coercion, by a powerful ruler forcing unwilling subjects to carry earth. The evidence suggests instead that, at least in its early phases, Cahokia grew through something more like mass enthusiasm, a genuine collective project undertaken by people who believed in what they were building. We know something about the belief system that may have powered this enthusiasm, though our knowledge is fragmentary and comes from the material remains of ritual behavior rather than from any written record. The Mississippian world was organized around a cosmological framework that archaeologists sometimes call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a set of symbols and ritual practices and beliefs about the structure of the universe that was shared, in varying forms, across a huge geographic area. At its heart was a vision of the cosmos divided into 3 layers: the upper world of sky and celestial order, the underworld of water and primordial chaos, and the this world, where human beings lived in a constant negotiation between the forces above and below. The great mounds, with their flat summits reaching toward the sky, were expressions of this cosmology. They were artificial mountains, places where the boundary between the upper world and the human world was thin, where the rituals of a priestly elite could maintain the cosmic balance that made agriculture productive and communities prosperous. Imagine arriving at Cahokia for the first time in, say, the year 1100 CE, approaching from the south along the floodplain. coming with a trade canoe loaded with shell beads from the Gulf Coast to exchange for the copper ornaments and stone tools that Cahokia's craftspeople produced. You would have been approaching what you knew to be the most important place in your world, the center of the Mississippian cosmos, the place where the order of the universe was maintained and renewed. From a distance, the first thing you would see would be the mounds. They would appear above the flat horizon of the floodplain like a range of earthen mountains, artificial and unmistakable. Monk's Mound, the great central pyramid, would dominate the skyline, its summit catching the morning light above the ground-level haze of cooking fires and morning mist that hung over the city. As you drew closer, you would begin to hear the city before you could fully see it. The sound of tens of thousands of people going about their daily lives would reach you across the water, the distant murmur of what sounded like a very large gathering that never ended. You would smell it too, wood smoke and roasting corn, and the rich biological smells of a large community living close together, cutting through the clean river air. The city was protected in its most important precincts by a great wooden stockade, a massive palisade wall made from thousands of large wooden posts set into a prepared trench and rising perhaps 12 to 15 feet above the ground. Archaeologists have found evidence that this wall was rebuilt at least 4 times during the city's history, each reconstruction suggesting either the decay of wooden materials over time or deliberate upgrading of the city's defenses. The stockade enclosed the central ceremonial precinct, an area of approximately 200 acres at the heart of the city that contained Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, several other major mounds, and presumably the residences of Cahokia's ruling elite. Outside the stockade, the city sprawled across the floodplain for miles in every direction, a dense urban fabric of houses and workshops and smaller mounds and open spaces that made up the residential neighborhoods of the metropolis. Inside the Grand Plaza, the scale of the place would have been breathtaking, even to someone who had visited before. The plaza was kept scrupulously clean and level, the earth packed hard by generations of feet and maintained by what must have been organized labor, because the natural tendency of the floodplain soil was to develop the minor irregularities that would disrupt the flat sacred surface the plaza was designed to present. At the north end of the plaza, Monk's Mound rose with an almost theatrical grandeur, its 4 terraces stepping upward to the summit that commanded views across the entire floodplain for miles in every direction. On the summit of the mound was a large building, presumably the residence of the paramount chief or the temple of the principal deity, or perhaps both, the sacred and the political, so thoroughly intertwined in Mississippian culture that the distinction may not have been meaningful. The mound itself communicated hierarchy in a language that needed no translation. The higher you lived and the higher you worshipped, the closer you were to the upper world, the realm of celestial order and divine authority. The flat ground at the base of the mound was where ordinary life happened, the messy, complicated, beautifully human business of markets and conversations and disputes and celebrations. But the summit of Monk's Mound was a different kind of place, reserved for those whose authority derived from their proximity to the powers that governed the cosmos. Looking up at it from the plaza floor, you would have understood, without being told, that the person who stood at that summit occupied a position that was not merely political but sacred, a mediator between the human world and the forces that controlled the seasons and the harvest and the continuation of life. Around the edges of the Grand Plaza, smaller mounds served various functions. Some were platform mounds that supported the residences of important people, Cahokia's aristocracy and its religious specialists. Some were conical mounds that served as burial monuments for important individuals. Some were ridgetop mounds of a form unique to the American bottom, whose function is still debated, but which may have served as markers or boundaries within the sacred precinct. The visual effect of all this earthen architecture arranged around the great open space of the plaza was one of intentional grandeur, of a city that had been designed by people who understood the psychology of space and used it deliberately to project power and sanctity. Beyond the central precinct, the residential districts of Cahokia housed a population that was, by all available evidence, genuinely diverse. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains from Cahokia's cemeteries has revealed that a significant portion of the people buried there were not born in the American bottom. They came from different places, drawn to the great city by trade or religious pilgrimage or political alliance or simple economic opportunity. This is one of the markers of genuine urban life, the city as a magnet that draws people from its hinterland and beyond. Cahokia was pulling people in from considerable distances, and the city they found when they arrived was, by the standards of anywhere in the world, in the year 1100 CE, a real city. The houses of the residential districts were rectangular, wattle and daub structures with thatched roofs, built in a distinctive Mississippian style that was similar across a huge geographic area. A typical house was perhaps 15 to 20 feet long and 10 to 15 feet wide, large enough for a nuclear family and their immediate possessions. The houses were organized into neighborhoods, clusters of residences arranged around smaller open courtyards or plazas that served as the social centers of the community at the neighborhood scale. The wealthy and the powerful lived in larger houses closer to the central precinct, while the ordinary working people of the city lived in denser concentrations farther out. This spatial expression of social hierarchy, the rich at the center and the poor at the periphery, is a pattern familiar from cities in every part of the world in every historical period, and its presence at Cahokia is another marker of the city's genuine urbanity. The total physical extent of the city at its height was roughly 5 square miles of continuous settlement within what archaeologists call the Cahokia site itself, with additional satellite communities extending the urban footprint considerably further. Estimates of population are inherently uncertain, given the difficulty of determining how many people occupied each structure at any given time, and how fully the site was occupied during its peak. The range most commonly cited by archaeologists is between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the immediate urban core, with another 10 to 20,000 in the dependent satellite communities within a day's travel. This would make Greater Cahokia a metropolitan area of perhaps 30 to 40,000 people at its maximum, a population comparable to many of the important cities of medieval Europe and considerably larger than most. Life in Cahokia was organized around rhythms that we can partially reconstruct from what people left behind, from the food remains in their fire pits and the tools in their workshops and the objects buried with their dead and the patterns of their structures revealed in the bare earth by the careful work of modern archaeologists. And what emerges from all of this careful looking is a portrait of a society that was sophisticated and stratified and busy, a society with specialists and elites and ordinary working people, with ritual obligations and market days and craft production and the full, complicated texture of a large human community navigating the demands of living together. Food was the foundation of everything. The maize fields that surrounded Cahokia on every available piece of arable floodplain were the caloric engine that powered the city. Corn was grown in the rich bottomland soil along the river, and its tributaries, tended by the labor of most of the population during the growing season, harvested in the fall and stored in large below-ground pits and above-ground granaries that could feed a family through the winter and into the next planting season. The archaeology of Cahokia's food storage is one of the clearest expressions of its social inequality. Elite households had access to larger quantities of stored food and to more diverse food sources than ordinary households. The elites ate more deer meat, more waterfowl, more fish from the river's better fishing grounds. The ordinary people ate more corn, more wild plant foods gathered from the margins of the fields and the edges of the wetlands, more freshwater mussels harvested from the shallows. This is not unusual for an early urban society. What is perhaps more surprising is the evidence for a genuine market economy operating alongside the redistributive system controlled by the elite. Cahokia's central precinct shows signs of large-scale craft production, workshops where skilled artisans produced goods in quantities that go beyond what any single household or even the elite could use. Pottery, stone tools, copper ornaments, shell beads, and perhaps cloth were produced in specialized contexts by people who may have traded their products in the same kinds of market exchanges that characterize urban economies everywhere. The Grand Plaza itself may have served as a market space at certain times, a place where the surplus production of the city and its hinterland was exchanged in a setting that was simultaneously sacred and commercial, where the boundaries between ritual and trade were permeable in the way that markets often are in early urban societies. The role of the non-maize foods in the Cahokia diet deserves particular attention because it tells us something important about how the city worked economically. Strontium isotope analysis of the teeth of people buried at Cahokia has established that many residents were not farmers themselves, or at least did not spend their childhoods in the agricultural communities of the floodplain. They came from elsewhere, and the food they ate as adults was not the food they had grown themselves. Someone was feeding these people. Someone was organizing the flow of food from the agricultural communities of the hinterland into the urban core, where the craftspeople and the priests and the administrators and the warriors lived. This kind of redistribution, this centralized collection and reallocation of agricultural surplus, is one of the defining characteristics of what archaeologists call chiefdom-level societies and early states. And its presence at Cahokia tells us that the city had achieved a level of political and economic organization that was, by any reasonable measure, sophisticated. The religious life of Cahokia was not separate from its political and economic life, but woven through it at every level. The Mississippian worldview did not distinguish between the sacred and the secular in the way that modern Western thought tends to. The ritual cycle was also the agricultural calendar. The power of the paramount chief was also the power of the cosmos, expressed through a human body. The great ceremonies that drew people to Cahokia from across the region were also the occasions when tribute was paid and trade was conducted, and political alliances were renewed, and the authority of the ruling elite was displayed, confirmed. We know enough about Mississippian ritual practice from the archaeological record, from the carved and engraved objects that expressed religious symbolism, from the physical evidence of ceremonial events found in the soil, and from the accounts of early European observers who encountered Mississippian-descended cultures in the southeast during the 16th and 17th centuries, to sketch at least a partial picture of what religious life at Cahokia might have looked like. The cosmological framework of three worlds, upper, under, and this world, shaped everything. The sky was watched carefully, and the positions of the sun and moon and stars were tracked with a precision that influenced the timing of ceremonies and agricultural activities. Evidence for this astronomical knowledge exists in the form of a series of large wooden posts arranged in circles at Cahokia, the largest of which was a ring nearly 400 feet across. Archaeologists call this structure Woodhenge. An analysis of the post alignments has revealed that certain posts were placed to mark the positions of sunrise at the solstices and equinoxes. The great ceremonies of the Cahokia year were aligned with the turning points of the solar calendar, linking the city's ritual life to the movements of the cosmos in a way that was both practical, because the agricultural calendar depended on knowing when to plant and harvest, and deeply symbolic. The paramount chief of Cahokia occupied a position at the intersection of the political and the sacred that had no clear parallel in any other North American culture north of Mexico. The chief was not merely a political leader, not merely a military commander, but something closer to what anthropologists call a divine king, a person whose body was understood to be a conduit between the human world and the supernatural forces that governed it. The health and power of the chief was identified with the health and productivity of the land. His rituals were not performances for an audience, but actual necessary interventions in the cosmic machinery that kept the seasons turning and the corn growing and the rivers running. This belief gave the paramount chief an authority that went beyond anything that political power alone could bestow, and it helps explain how the labor for Cahokia's monumental construction could have been mobilized without the kind of coercive apparatus, the written bureaucracy, and the professional military force that we associate with state-level political organization. Among the recreational and ritual activities that defined life in Cahokia, one stands out with particular vividness from the archaeological record, a game called Chunky. The game was played with a smooth stone disc, the Chunky stone, that was typically several inches in diameter and carefully shaped to roll smoothly and predictably when set in motion. Players would roll the stone along a prepared clay surface and then throw long poles after it, attempting to land the pole as close as possible to the spot where the stone came to rest. The game was, on its face, a throwing competition that rewarded accuracy and an ability to read the motion of the rolling stone, but Chunky was much more than a game in the casual modern sense. It was associated with the chief in a way that made it a ritual performance as much as a sport. Early historical accounts from European observers of Mississippian-descended cultures describe the Chunky stone as a sacred object that was inherited by chiefs and passed down as a symbol of chiefly authority. The playing of Chunky was a way of displaying and reinforcing the power of the elite, a performance of the cosmic order in the form of athletic competition. The Grand Plaza at Cahokia, that great flat swept space of nearly 200 acres, was in part a Chunky court. The vast scale of the plaza made it possible to run the game at a size and a spectacle that smaller communities could not match, turning what might be an intimate village pastime into a theatrical event that could accommodate thousands of spectators. The social function of this spectacle should not be underestimated. The gathering of large numbers of people to watch elite competitors play a game that was associated with divine authority was a form of political theatre as effective as any public monument. The crowd was not merely entertained. It was incorporated into a ritual drama that confirmed the existing social order and expressed the cosmic significance of the city at its centre. But the most disturbing evidence for the ritual life of Cahokia and the aspect of the city's history that perhaps most dramatically underlines its claims to a kind of urban sophistication that is easy to overlook comes from a site just south of Monk's Mound that archaeologists now call Mound 7-2. This mound was excavated in the 1960s and 1970s by Melvin Fowler and his colleagues, and what they found beneath its surface was one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries ever made in North America. Mound 72 was not a platform mound or a burial mound of the ordinary type. It was a ridge-top mound, one of the distinctive forms peculiar to the American bottom, and beneath it lay evidence of ritualized death on a scale that speaks unambiguously to the power and the ruthlessness of whoever controlled Cahokia at its height. The most famous burial within Mound 72 was a man laid on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon or possibly a birdman, one of the most important figures in Mississippian iconography. The birdman, as this figure is sometimes called, represents a powerful supernatural being who mediated between the upper world and the this world, a cosmic champion associated with the South, with summer, with agricultural fertility, and with political authority. The man buried on the beaded falcon was almost certainly a paramount chief, or a figure of equivalent sacred authority, buried in a manner that identified him directly with the most powerful figure in the Mississippian cosmos. Around and beneath this central burial were dozens of other burials, and these are what revealed the darkest dimension of Cahokia's power. Archaeologists found groups of young women, hundreds of them in total, across the mound's burial features, most of them apparently killed and deposited simultaneously, in a pattern that strongly suggests sacrificial execution. In one feature, 53 young women between the ages of 15 and 25 were found in a single deposit, their bodies arranged in neat rows. In another, more than 40 more. These were not people who had been buried over time in a conventional cemetery. The simultaneous nature of the depositions, the apparent selection by age and sex, and the physical evidence of how they died all point toward organized ritual sacrifice on a scale that is deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities. The sacrifice of human beings as part of the installation of a new chief, or the burial of an important chief, is a pattern known from other complex societies in history, from ancient Egypt to the royal burials at in Mesopotamia to the tombs of Chinese rulers. It is not a practice that archaeologists encounter without discomfort, but it is a practice that tells us something important about the kind of power that existed at Cahokia. A chief whose death could mobilize the deaths of hundreds of other people was a chief whose authority was total, whose identity with the cosmic order was so complete that his departure required a corresponding sacrifice to maintain the balance between the worlds. Whatever we think of this practice from our own moral position, it tells us that Cahokia was a real polity, a place where real power was exercised over real human beings, in ways that the archaeological record preserves in the most visceral and permanent form possible. The trade networks that connected Cahokia to the wider world were as important to its power and prosperity as its agricultural base or its religious authority. The city was not merely a local phenomenon, but the center of a continental system of exchange that drew materials and people from an almost incomprehensible geographic range. Copper came from the mines of the Lake Superior region, nearly 1,000 miles to the north. Marine shells, particularly the large conch shells used for ornaments and ceremonial vessels, came from the Gulf Coast, 1,000 miles to the south. Chert, a fine-grained stone used for making high-quality tools, came from quarries scattered across the Midwest. Mica came from the mountains of the southeast. Galena, a lead ore used for body paint and as a ritual material, came from specific deposits in what is now Missouri and Wisconsin. Each of these materials was valuable. Each required long-distance travel or exchange to obtain, and each moved through a network that had Cahokia at or near its center. The goods that moved along these networks were not primarily utilitarian. They were prestige objects, things whose value lay not in their practical utility, but in their rarity, their beauty, their associations with distant places or supernatural power, and their role in confirming the status of those who possessed them. The long-distance trade of Cahokia was the trade of an elite, producing and circulating the symbols of authority that the paramount chief and the aristocracy below him needed to maintain their positions in the social hierarchy. A necklace of Gulf Coast shells did not make its Cahokia owner richer in any practical sense, but it demonstrated connections, access to distant resources, the kind of far-reaching authority that was itself a form of power in the Mississippian world. The flow of ideas along these trade networks was as important as the flow of objects. The Mississippian cultural tradition, with its distinctive pottery and its mound building and its cosmological framework and its symbolic vocabulary of birdmen and serpents and cosmic warriors, spread from Cahokia outward across a huge geographic area during the 11th and 12th centuries. Whether this spread happened through the migration of Cahokia's people, the deliberate export of Cahokia's ideology by its paramount chief, or the attractive power of a prestige system that other communities wanted to join, is a question that archaeologists continue to debate. What is not debated is the fact of the spread itself. From the Spiro site in what is now Oklahoma, to the Moundville site in Alabama, to the towns of the Illinois River Valley, the material, culture, and symbolic system of Cahokia's Mississippian tradition left its mark across the eastern half of the continent. To understand why Cahokia eventually fell, we first need to understand more clearly who the Cahokians were, not as an abstract population or an archaeological culture, but as human beings navigating the specific social realities of a city that was growing faster than any community in the region had ever grown before. The challenges of Cahokia's rapid growth were not merely logistical, though they were certainly that. They were also deeply human challenges. The challenges of building social cohesion among people who came from different communities with different traditions, of managing the inevitable tensions that arise when a large number of people are required to live close together and cooperate in the production of common goods, and of maintaining the legitimacy of an elite whose authority rested on claims that were always, in some sense, difficult to demonstrate concretely. The people who came to Cahokia came for different reasons and brought different things with them. The farmers who provided the agricultural surplus that fed the city were, in many cases, not Cahokians by birth. They were people from the surrounding hinterland communities who had been drawn into the city's orbit, some perhaps choosing to move their households into the city's expanding residential districts, others remaining in their villages, but now oriented toward the demands of a central place that required tribute in the form of food and labor. The craftspeople who produced Cahokia's prestige goods were specialists whose skills set them apart from the agricultural majority, people whose identity was tied to their craft tradition and who may have occupied a specific social niche that gave them both economic value and certain kinds of privilege. The religious specialists, the priests, and the diviners, and the keepers of sacred knowledge occupied positions of enormous influence in a society where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not a boundary at all, but a continuous surface. And at the apex of the social hierarchy sat the paramount chief and the aristocratic lineages that surrounded him. People whose inherited position gave them access to the best land, the most food, the most valuable trade goods, and the greatest authority over the lives of everyone below them. This social pyramid was not stable in the long run. The evidence for social inequality at Cahokia is not subtle. The physical contrast between elite residences near the Mounds and ordinary residences in the outer districts is clear in the archaeological record. The contrast in burial goods is even clearer. The elaborate burial rituals reserved for the most important individuals, with their shell bead capes and copper axes and elaborate grave offerings, stand in stark contrast to the simple graves of ordinary Cahokians that contain little beyond the body. The inequality expressed in the mortuary record of Mound 72, with its hundreds of apparently sacrificed young women surrounding the beaded burial of a paramount chief, is perhaps the most extreme expression of a social hierarchy that permeated every aspect of life in the city. But the thing about social inequality, in any society, in any historical period, is that it must be legitimated. The people on the bottom of the hierarchy must, at some level, accept, or at least not actively resist, the claims of those at the top. In Mississippian Cahokia, this legitimacy was maintained primarily through ideology, through the belief that the paramount chief's position in the cosmic order was not a human construction, but a fact of the universe, that the chief's rituals were genuinely necessary to maintain the balance that kept the corn growing and the seasons turning and the community prospering. This ideological legitimacy could survive a great deal of material inequality as long as the beliefs that underpinned it remained credible to most of the population. But credibility is fragile. It depends on outcomes. It depends on the harvest actually being good, and the winter actually being survivable, and the disease actually not killing too many children. When the outcomes start to fail, the ideology starts to crack, and the crack can widen very quickly. The first signs of stress in Cahokia's social fabric appear in the archaeological record sometime around the late 12th century, roughly 100 to 150 years after the city's explosive founding. The changes are subtle at first, not dramatic collapses, but shifts in the pattern of daily life that accumulate into something significant when viewed across the full span of the archaeological evidence. One of the earliest and most revealing is a change in the pattern of household organization within the city's residential districts. In the early period of Cahokia's history, houses were clustered in groups around shared open courtyards, and the archaeological evidence from these courtyard groups suggests a pattern of communal activity of households that shared cooking facilities and storage spaces, and perhaps ritual activities in a pattern that implies genuine social cohesion at the neighborhood level. By the late 12th century, this pattern had begun to change. Houses became more isolated from one another. The shared courtyard spaces shrank or disappeared. The material evidence suggests a retreat inward, households becoming more self-contained, less integrated into the broader community fabric of the neighborhood. This kind of withdrawal from communal life is a pattern that social scientists have observed in contemporary societies under stress, when trust in shared institutions declines and people pull back into the safety of immediate family and kin group. Whether the same dynamic was at work in late 12th century Cahokia is impossible to say with certainty, but the parallel is at least suggestive. Something was causing the social bonds that had made the city cohere to weaken. The palisade wall around the central precinct, which was rebuilt multiple times during Cahokia's history, may also tell a story about increasing social tension. In the early period, the wall may have served primarily as a ritual boundary, a demarcation of sacred space, rather than a defensive fortification in any practical sense. But the later rebuilds of the palisade, which show evidence of additional bastions and reinforced construction, suggest a wall that was increasingly oriented toward actual defense, toward the physical protection of the elite precinct from a potential threat. The threat that the later palisade was designed against may have been external, from the raid or the attack of an outside enemy, but it may also have been internal, a reflection of the growing tensions within the city itself between the elite in their protected precinct and the increasingly stressed population in the outer districts. Cahokia's relationship with the climate was always more intimate and more vulnerable than its impressive monuments might suggest. The agricultural foundation of the city's economy was dependent on seasonal rainfall patterns that could shift dramatically from year to year in the mid-continent and the medieval warm period. That had contributed to the city's rise was not a period of constant, favorable conditions, but a general tendency toward warmth that still included significant year-to-year and decade-to-decade variability. Paleoecological records from the American bottom and surrounding regions reveal that the 12th and 13th centuries saw increasing climate instability in the region, with more frequent droughts and floods and more unpredictable seasonal patterns than the city's early founders had enjoyed. For an agricultural economy operating at the margins of what the land could support to feed a large urban population, this kind of climate variability was not merely inconvenient, it was potentially catastrophic. A bad growing season meant insufficient food stored for the winter. A very bad growing season meant starvation for the most vulnerable members of the community. A sequence of bad growing seasons meant the erosion of the stored surplus that provided the cushion against crop failure, and the erosion of the population's confidence in the ability of the elite to maintain the cosmic order that the elite claimed was their primary function. The people who built the mounds and grew the corn and paid tribute to the paramount chief had been promised, implicitly, that their labor and their loyalty would be rewarded with divine protection, with the good harvests and the stable seasons that were the chief's responsibility to ensure. When the harvests began to fail, that promise was broken. The Mississippi River itself was both Cahokia's greatest asset and one of its most serious threats. The river's floods replenished the soil of the floodplain with the sediment that made it so extraordinarily productive, but the same floods could and did inundate fields and destroy stored food and displace communities without warning. Paleohydrological studies have revealed that the late 12th and early 13th centuries saw an increase in the frequency and severity of major floods in the Mississippi River Valley, events that would have had direct and devastating effects on the agricultural communities in the American bottom. Some of these floods may have been so severe as to render parts of the floodplain unsuitable for agriculture for extended periods, forcing the population to contract toward higher ground and reducing the total agricultural output available to feed the city. The combination of climate instability and increased flooding was happening against a backdrop of a social structure that was already showing signs of stress. The city's population may have reached something close to its maximum carrying capacity, the point at which the available agricultural land could not reliably support a larger number of people. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the early 13th century, the density of settlement in some parts of the Cahokia landscape was high enough to have caused genuine environmental stress, including the deforestation of the upland areas surrounding the floodplain, as the demand for firewood and construction timber exceeded the natural regenerative capacity of the forest. Deforestation, in turn, would have contributed to increased soil erosion, reduced soil quality, and changes in local hydrology that made the agricultural situation even less stable. Into this already fragile situation came a shift in the long-distance trade networks that had been one of Cahokia's most important sources of power and prestige. Archaeological evidence suggests that sometime in the late 12th or early 13th century, the great trade connections that had brought copper from Lake Superior and shells from the Gulf Coast and chert from the Ozarks into Cahokia's workshops began to weaken or reorganize. Whether this was because Cahokia's political authority over the trade networks was declining, allowing other centers to establish their own connections, or because the demand for Cahokia's goods was falling as regional polities developed their own craft production, or because the disruptions within the city itself were making it a less reliable trading partner, is not clear. But the material evidence is clear enough. The flow of exotic prestige goods through Cahokia appears to have diminished over the course of the 13th century, and with it, one of the key mechanisms by which the elite maintained its authority and its distance from ordinary people. The long goodbye of Cahokia, the slow process of depopulation that unfolded across the 13th and into the 14th century, left clear traces in the archaeological record that tell a story of incremental abandonment rather than sudden catastrophe. Population estimates for the city across this period show a steady and apparently inexorable decline from the heights of the early 12th century. The outer residential districts were depopulated first, the neighborhoods farthest from the central precinct emptying out as households chose to relocate or simply ceased to be replenished as people died and were not replaced by new residents. The central precinct held on longer, the elite maintaining their presence at the heart of the city, even as the urban fabric around them thinned and then disappeared. The mound construction that had defined the city's first century apparently ceased sometime during this period. No new major mounds were added to the landscape. The existing mounds were maintained to varying degrees, but the monumental ambition that had created them was not renewed. This is one of the most revealing aspects of the decline, because the construction of mounds had been not merely an engineering project, but an expression of the political and religious will that held the city together. When that construction stopped, it was a signal that the ideology powering it had lost its force. The pottery of the late Cahokia period shows changes in style and production that archaeologists interpret as evidence of the breakdown of the specialized craft production that had been one of the city's economic hallmarks. The careful, standardized production of the city's peak was replaced by more varied, less technically accomplished ceramics that suggest the dispersal of the specialist workshops and the return of household-level production. The trade goods that had circulated through those workshops became rarer. The evidence of long-distance connections faded from the archaeological record of the site. By sometime around 1300 CE, the population of the Cahokia site had been reduced to a small fraction of its former self. By 1350, most archaeologists believe the site was essentially uninhabited. The last families to leave would have walked away from a city that still bore the physical traces of its former greatness, the great mounds still rising from the floodplain, the outlines of the stockade still visible, the hardened surface of the Grand Plaza still firm underfoot, the remnants of thousands of structures still marking the ground. But the people were gone, and there was no one left to maintain the sacred fires or perform the rituals that had once drawn pilgrims from a continent away. Where did they go? This is one of the questions that haunts the archaeology of Cahokia. The people did not simply disappear, they went somewhere, and they took their knowledge and their traditions and their material culture with them. The most likely answer, supported by the distribution of Mississippian sites across the eastern half of the continent after 1300, is that Cahokia's population dispersed into the surrounding region, some moving into the smaller Mississippian communities that continued to exist in the Illinois River Valley and elsewhere, some perhaps moving further afield to join or establish communities in areas outside the immediate hinterland of the old city. The Mississippian tradition did not die with Cahokia. It continued to flourish in other parts of the Southeast and Midwest for another 2 centuries, until the catastrophic disruptions brought by European contact in the 16th century. Some archaeologists have suggested that the descendants of Cahokia's population may be found among several historic indigenous nations of the region, including the Osage, the Quapaw, the Ponca, and others who speak Siouan languages that may have connections to the linguistic tradition of the Cahokia area. Others point to connections with the Algonquian-speaking peoples who were present in the Illinois area when Europeans arrived, or with the communities that would eventually become the Chickasaw or Choctaw farther to the south. None of these connections has been established with the kind of certainty that most archaeologists would require, partly because the 2-century gap between Cahokia's abandonment and the first European observations of the region makes direct continuity difficult to trace, and partly because oral historical traditions that might preserve memory of the great city are fragmentary and contested. What we can say with confidence is that Cahokia's abandonment was not the end of indigenous civilization in the American bottom. Life continued in the region, as it always had, organized at smaller scales and in different forms. But the extraordinary experiment that Cahokia represented, the attempt to build and sustain an urban center of continental significance in the middle of pre-Columbian North America, was not repeated. When European explorers arrived in the Mississippi River Valley in the 17th century, they found a landscape of mounds, but no cities, a monument to a past that had been forgotten by the very people whose ancestors had built it. The story of how the modern world came to understand Cahokia is itself a story that reveals a great deal about the history of European settlement in North America, about the assumptions that settlers brought with them, and about the long, slow, sometimes painful process of overcoming those assumptions in the face of accumulating evidence. When the first European Americans encountered the mounds of the American bottom in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, they were confronted with physical evidence of a past that did not fit their assumptions about the indigenous people of the continent. The mounds were obviously human constructions. The scale of the largest of them was obviously beyond what any small community could accomplish. Someone, at some point, had organized the labor of many people over long periods to build these earthen monuments. But the indigenous people the settlers encountered in the region appeared to have no knowledge of who built the mounds or why they had not built them, or at least, as far as the settlers could determine, they had not. And the cognitive gap between the evident ambition of the mounds and the settlers' assumptions about the incapacity of indigenous people for such ambition produced the mound builder myth. The mound builder myth, in its most elaborate forms, attributed the construction of the North American earthworks to a variety of lost or vanished civilizations that were explicitly distinguished from the indigenous people who were present when Europeans arrived. Lost tribes of Israel, Welsh colonists who had supposedly crossed the Atlantic in the 12th century, survivors of a sunken Atlantic civilization in the tradition of Plato's Atlantis, ancient Hindus or Phoenicians or Egyptians who had visited and built before sailing away. The myth took many forms, but its fundamental premise was consistent. The indigenous people of North America could not have built the mounds, therefore someone else must have done it. This was not simply ignorance, though ignorance was certainly part of it. The mound builder myth served a specific ideological function in the context of European American expansion. If the mounds had been built by a distinct and vanished race, rather than by the ancestors of the people who currently occupied the land, then the history of the continent could be told as a story of multiple waves of colonization, in which indigenous people were themselves invaders who had displaced or destroyed the true original inhabitants. This narrative was enormously convenient for the purposes of justifying the dispossession of the indigenous people of the East and Midwest, since it implied that their claim to the land was no more legitimate than anyone else's. The mound builder myth was not merely an archaeological error, it was a politically useful fiction. The fiction was demolished, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, by the patient accumulation of archaeological evidence across the 19th century. The publication in 1894 of Cyrus Thomas's report on the mounds of the eastern United States, based on years of systematic investigation by the Bureau of American Ethnology, effectively ended serious scientific support for the mound builder myth. Thomas demonstrated, through the careful analysis of hundreds of sites across the region, that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the indigenous people who were present when Europeans arrived, and that the cultures responsible for the most impressive earthworks were connected by continuous archaeological sequences to the historic indigenous nations of the area. The mounds were not the work of a mysterious lost race. They were the work of the people whose descendants were still living on the land. The archaeological study of Cahokia specifically has a history that begins in earnest in the 20th century, though the site was known and partly described by antiquarian observers from the early 19th century onward. The Trappist monks, who lived on and around Monk's Mound in the early 1800s, gave that mound its current name, but did not investigate it systematically. Various travelers and local historians commented on the mounds over the following decades, but serious archaeological investigation did not begin until the mid-20th century, when the growing importance of the site to understanding pre-Columbian North American history began to attract the attention of professional archaeologists. The decades from the 1960s through the 1990s saw an enormous expansion of archaeological knowledge about Cahokia, driven partly by deliberate research projects and partly by the requirements of cultural resource management, the process by which archaeological sites must be investigated before modern construction destroys them. The construction of Interstate 255 and Interstate 55 through the American Bottom region in the 1960s and 1970s triggered large-scale salvage excavations that recovered an enormous amount of information about the site and its hinterland. Melvin Fowler's excavations at Mound 72 in the late 1960s and early 1970s produced the spectacular results we have already described. Warren Whittry's identification of the Woodhenge post circles established Cahokia's astronomical knowledge as an archaeological reality rather than a speculation. Timothy Porketat's long career of research at and around Cahokia, spanning from the 1980s into the present century, has fundamentally reshaped the scholarly understanding of how the city emerged, how it was organized, and how it declined. What continues to emerge from this decades-long project of archaeological investigation is a picture of Cahokia that is more complicated, more nuanced, and more fully human than the simple story of rise and fall that might seem adequate from a distance. The city was not merely a political project, or an economic project, or a religious project. It was all of these things simultaneously, and the tensions between them, the way that economic inequality chafed against religious ideology, the way that political authority depended on demonstrating cosmic connections that were always ultimately unprovable, the way that urban growth created logistical challenges that the city's institutions were not always equal to, are visible in the archaeological record if you know how to read it. One of the most revealing lines of recent research has focused on the question of violence at Cahokia. Not only the ritual violence of Mound 72, but the evidence of interpersonal violence, conflict, and potential warfare that is preserved in the skeletal remains from the city's cemeteries and in the defensive architecture of the palisade. Analysis of skeletal trauma in Cahokia period burials has revealed rates of violence-related injury that are, by the standards of what archaeologists find in most pre-urban societies in North America, elevated. Some of this violence appears to have been interpersonal, the ordinary violence of a large community with inevitable conflicts. Some of it appears to have been more organized, suggesting raiding or warfare either within the city's hinterland or between Cahokia and neighboring polities. And some of it appears to be associated with the ritual violence that we have already seen in the mortuary evidence, suggesting that the boundaries between organized warfare, political execution, and ritual sacrifice were not always clearly drawn. The evidence of violence at Cahokia, particularly the pattern that emerges from the mid-12th century onward, is consistent with a society under increasing stress. When resources become scarcer and the social contract between the elite and the ordinary population begins to break down, violence tends to increase. The rebuilding of the palisade with additional defensive features, the evidence of skeletal trauma rising over time, and the patterns of burning and abandonment visible in some residential areas of the site, all suggest that the last century of Cahokia's occupation was not peaceful. The city was not simply emptying out quietly as people made rational choices to seek better opportunities elsewhere. It was also experiencing the kind of social conflict that accompanies serious institutional breakdown. Now we come to the central question of the Cahokia paradox, the question that has occupied archaeologists and historians and anthropologists for decades, and to which there is still no single, universally accepted answer. Why did Cahokia fall? What, specifically, caused the largest city in pre-Columbian North America to go from a metropolis of tens of thousands of people to an empty field in the space of 200 years? Several major theories have been proposed, and they are not mutually exclusive. The most complete understanding of Cahokia's decline is probably one that incorporates elements of several of them, recognizing that complex urban systems rarely fail for simple, single reasons. The first and perhaps most prominent theory emphasizes environmental degradation and climate change. This argument holds that Cahokia's intensive use of the American bottom landscape was ultimately unsustainable. that the combination of forest clearance for agriculture and firewood, soil exhaustion from continuous cropping, and the disruption of local hydrology by large-scale earth-moving gradually eroded the environmental foundation that the city depended on. The climate instability of the 13th century, with its increased frequency of drought and flood, pushed an already stressed agricultural system over the edge. The city could no longer feed itself, and the population had no choice but to disperse into less degraded landscapes where smaller communities could survive on what the land offered. This theory has the virtue of explanatory power and the support of substantial paleoecological evidence. The pollen records, the sediment cores, the soil chemistry data from the American bottom all tell a consistent story of environmental stress during the period of Cahokia's decline. The deforestation of the uplands is visible in the pollen record as a dramatic reduction in tree species and an increase in the weedy plants that characterize disturbed ground. The soil erosion is visible in the stratigraphy of the bottomland deposits. The fossil record of the river itself shows changes in fish populations that are consistent with increased turbidity and reduced water quality from erosion. The environment of the American bottom was measurably different and measurably worse for human subsistence purposes at the end of Cahokia's occupation than it had been at the beginning. The second major theory focuses on political and social breakdown. This argument holds that the fundamental problem with Cahokia was not environmental but institutional, that the political system that had built and maintained the city contained within it the seeds of its own dissolution. The paramount chieftaincy that stood at the apex of Cahokia's political structure was, like all chieftaincy systems, inherently unstable in the long run. Unlike states with professional bureaucracies and legal codes and mechanisms for the regular transfer of power, chieftaincy systems depend heavily on the personal authority of the chief, on his ability to maintain the loyalty of subordinate elites and the acquiescence of the general population through a combination of redistribution, coercion, and ideological legitimacy. When any of these mechanisms failed, and in complex societies all of them eventually failed in some fashion, the structure they supported could collapse very quickly. The evidence for political instability at Cahokia in the later period of its history is consistent with this theory. The changes in settlement patterns, the retreat of households from communal courtyard arrangements to more isolated configurations, the apparent cessation of monumental construction, the evidence of increasing violence, all of these are consistent with a society in which the political authority of the center was weakening, and the population was responding by withdrawing from the obligations and the risks of life in the city. The countryside, where smaller communities could organize themselves without the burden of supporting an elaborate elite, may have begun to look more attractive than the city. A third theory emphasizes what we might call a crisis of belief. This argument holds that the ideological foundation of Cahokia's authority, the belief that the paramount chief was a divine mediator whose rituals maintained cosmic order, was not merely a cynical manipulation by the elite, but a genuine shared framework that gave the city's social contract its force. When the climate began to fail, and the harvests became unreliable, and the floods became more frequent and more damaging, the promises that the ideology had implicitly made were broken in the most public and demonstrable way possible. The people who had organized their lives around the belief that the chief's rituals kept the cosmos in order watched the cosmos fail to respond. And when the ideology lost its credibility, the social structure it supported lost its legitimacy, and the people began to make different choices about where and how to live. This theory is difficult to evaluate directly from the archaeological record because belief leaves fewer material traces than behavior, but it is consistent with what we know about the role of ideology in maintaining social inequality in early complex societies, and it is consistent with the timing of Cahokia's decline, which appears to follow closely on the period of greatest environmental stress. The chief's failures were not merely practical failures, they were cosmic failures, violations of the most fundamental promises that the ruling ideology had made to the people who supported it. A fourth perspective, increasingly prominent in recent archaeological literature, emphasizes the role of disease. The large urban population of Cahokia, concentrated in a relatively small area without sophisticated sanitation infrastructure, would have been extremely vulnerable to infectious disease in ways that the smaller, more dispersed communities of the pre-urban period were not. The same conditions that made cities productive, the density of population and the concentration of trade connections that brought people together from distant places, also made cities efficient vectors for the spread of epidemic disease. We have no direct written record of epidemic events at Cahokia, but the skeletal evidence from the city's cemeteries does show elevated frequencies of pathological conditions associated with nutritional stress and infectious disease. And the temporal pattern of population decline may be consistent with the effects of repeated epidemic events. The disease hypothesis is particularly interesting when considered in light of recent research on pathogen evolution in early urban settings. The concentration of large numbers of people in close proximity, along with the domestic animals that Cahokians kept, creates the conditions under which new pathogenic strains can emerge and spread with devastating rapidity. Whether Cahokia experienced the kind of epidemic that could accelerate its decline from a deteriorating but potentially recoverable condition to a true urban collapse is a question that requires more evidence to answer definitively, but it cannot be ruled out. A fifth, and perhaps most haunting possibility, is one that has received increased attention in recent years, as archaeologists have paid more careful attention to the evidence for internal conflict and inequality at Cahokia. This theory suggests that the city's decline was not simply a response to external pressures, whether environmental or climatic or epidemiological, but was also driven from below by the resistance and ultimately the refusal of ordinary people to continue supporting a system that demanded much of them while delivering diminishing returns. The increasing evidence of social withdrawal, of declining participation in the communal activities that the elite required, of violence that may reflect internal class conflict as much as external raiding, all of this is consistent with a population that was voting with its feet against a social order that had stopped working for them. This is perhaps the most radical interpretation of Cahokia's decline, because it refuses to treat the ordinary people of the city as passive victims of impersonal forces and insists on seeing them as historical agents who made choices, including the ultimately decisive choice to leave. In this reading, Cahokia did not simply collapse. It was abandoned, deliberately and finally, by the people who had been carrying it on their backs. The process of rediscovering Cahokia, of dragging it back from obscurity into historical consciousness, has been as much a cultural and political process as a scientific one. The mound builder myth, as we have discussed, was not merely an innocent misunderstanding, but an ideologically motivated misreading that served the interests of a settler society that preferred its history without indigenous achievement. The demolition of that myth by professional archaeology was a necessary correction, but the correction has not fully permeated popular consciousness in the way it has permeated professional archaeology. The fact that most people who live in the St. Louis metropolitan area have never visited Cahokia Mound State Historic Site, despite the fact that it sits within easy driving distance and represents one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on the continent, says something about the way that pre-Columbian history has been marginalized in the historical consciousness of the United States. Cahokia Mound's State Historic Site was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, one of only 24 in the United States and the only one in the state of Illinois. The designation recognizes the site as being of outstanding universal value to humanity, a judgment that places it alongside the pyramids of Giza and the Great Wall of China and Stonehenge in the global canon of places that the human past has left as its most significant monuments. This is not hyperbole. Cahokia is genuinely among the most important archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere, and its story genuinely matters for understanding the full range of what human civilization has been capable of across the globe and across time. The site today preserves about 80 of the original 120 or more mounds that once covered the Cahokia landscape. The rest have been destroyed, largely by the agricultural and urban development that has proceeded in the American bottom since European-American settlement began in the late 18th century. Some of the destroyed mounds were ploughed down by farmers who found them inconvenient. Some were quarried for the fill that was used to build early roads and levees. Some were consumed by the construction of suburban housing developments and commercial strips that expanded from the St. Louis metropolitan area across the floodplain in the 20th century. The destruction of archaeological heritage is always a loss, but the losses at Cahokia have been particularly significant because so much of the site's information is irreplaceable and because the mounds that were destroyed cannot be recovered. What survives is still extraordinary. Monk's Mound, the Great Central Pyramid, still stands nearly as tall as it did at Cahokia's height, though erosion and settling have reduced it somewhat from its original dimensions. Walking up the face of Monk's Mound on a clear day is an experience that stops time in a way that few places in North America can manage. From the summit, you can see across the floodplain in every direction, the Mississippi visible in the distance to the west, the bluffs of the Illinois uplands rising to the east. The view is not dramatically different from what a person standing on this summit in the year 1100 would have seen. The basic geography unchanged, even though everything human in the landscape has been transformed beyond recognition. Standing there, you can feel something of what Cahokia must have felt to the people who built it and lived in it, the scale of the human ambition expressed in the monument beneath your feet, the audacity of the choice to build something so large in a place so exposed. The interpretive center at the site does an excellent job of presenting the current state of archaeological knowledge about Cahokia to the general public, with artifact displays, reconstructed architectural models, and multimedia presentations that convey something of the city's complexity and scale. The ongoing archaeological research at and around the site, involving a growing number of universities and research institutions, continues to produce new findings that deepen and sometimes revise the existing picture. Remote sensing technology, including ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR surveying, has revealed the presence of previously unknown features beneath the surface of the site, suggesting that the archaeology of Cahokia is far from exhausted. New isotopic analyses of skeletal remains continue to reveal information about the city's population, its diet, its health, and its geographic connections. New paleoecological studies continue to refine the picture of the environmental changes that accompanied and may have contributed to the city's decline. Among the most intriguing recent research developments is work that has been done on the question of Cahokia's political organization, specifically on the question of whether the city was governed by a hereditary ruling dynasty or by a different kind of political structure. Timothy Paucatat and other scholars have argued that the initial expansion of Cahokia may have been driven less by traditional hereditary chiefly authority and more by a kind of mass religious movement, a charismatic eruption of shared belief that mobilized labor on a continental scale before settling into the more hierarchical structures that characterize the city's later period. If this is correct, it adds another dimension to the story of Cahokia's rise and fall, because it suggests that the city was founded on an ideological energy that was always going to be difficult to sustain across generations, always going to face the problem of routinization, the gradual transformation of charismatic authority into bureaucratic authority that sociologist Max Weber identified as one of the central dynamics of institutional development. Recent scholarship has also paid increasing attention to the question of what happened to the people who left Cahokia, tracing the dispersal of the Mississippian population through the material record of sites across the region, and trying to connect the archaeology to the oral histories and cultural memories of the indigenous nations that lived in the region when Europeans arrived. This work is complicated by the 2-century gap between Cahokia's abandonment and the first European observations, during which the population underwent changes that are difficult to trace archaeologically. But it is important work because it insists on seeing the Cahokian people not as a civilization that disappeared, but as human beings who continued their lives in new places with new arrangements, carrying the knowledge and traditions of the city with them into a future that eventually encountered the catastrophe of European colonization. The encounter with European colonization is itself part of the Cahokia story, though it comes after the city's decline. The Mississippian cultures that continued to flourish in the southeast after Cahokia's abandonment were among the most complex and well-organized societies that the first European explorers encountered on the continent. Hernando de Soto's brutal expedition through the southeast between 1539 and 1542 encountered a series of Mississippian chiefdoms, some of them large and powerful, with towns on platform mounds and paramount chiefs who were carried in litters and whose authority extended over considerable territories. De Soto's expedition was also a vector for epidemic disease, and the population collapse that followed European contact transformed the social landscape of the southeast so completely that by the time later European colonists arrived to establish permanent settlements, many of the complex chiefdoms had already collapsed, their populations decimated and their political structures dissolved. The trajectory that runs from Cahokia's abandonment around 1350 through the continued but diminishing Mississippian presence in the region to the catastrophic impact of European contact in the 16th century is a continuous story of a civilization that was already under pressure before the European arrival, and that did not survive the biological and political shock of that arrival. This is not to say that Cahokia caused its own demise, or that the indigenous people of the continent were somehow historically destined for the outcome that European colonization imposed. It is simply to note that the story of Cahokia does not end with the abandonment of the Mounds, that the people and their descendants continued to navigate the world with skill and resilience for centuries, and that what finally overwhelmed them was not something they had done wrong, but something that was done to them. The question of what Cahokia means, of why it matters to know about a city that was abandoned 700 years ago in the middle of a continent that most people do not associate with pre-Columbian urban civilization, is worth asking directly. Several answers come to mind, and each of them is genuinely important. The first is the most straightforward. Cahokia challenges and corrects a profoundly distorted picture of pre-Columbian North America. The standard historical narrative of the continent before European arrival is one of sparsely populated wilderness, of hunter-gatherers and small-scale farmers living lightly on the land in stable, unchanging patterns. This narrative is false. North America, before European arrival, was a densely populated, culturally diverse, historically dynamic continent, home to hundreds of distinct societies at varying levels of social complexity, many of them with long histories of interaction, conflict, trade, and cultural exchange. Cahokia is the most dramatic expression of this reality in the northern part of the continent, but it is not unique in kind, only in scale. Knowing about Cahokia means knowing that the history of North America before 1492 is as complicated and as interesting as the history of any other part of the world. The second reason Cahokia matters is what it reveals about the dynamics of urban life and urban failure. The story of Cahokia, a city that rose rapidly on the basis of agricultural surplus, ideological enthusiasm, and long-distance trade, reached a population that stressed its environmental and political foundations beyond what those foundations could support, and then declined. As the multiple systems that held it together failed in a cascade of reinforcing pressures, is a story that has been told in other contexts, in other parts of the world. The parallel with the classic Maya collapse of the 9th century is particularly striking. A complex society at the height of its cultural and political achievement, brought down by a combination of climate stress, agricultural degradation, political fragmentation, and internal social conflict that the society's institutions were not equipped to address. The parallels do not need to imply determinism, do not need to suggest that all complex societies inevitably fail in the same way, but they do suggest that certain dynamics of urban and civilizational growth, the tendency toward overextension, the fragility of ideological legitimacy under material stress, the difficulty of managing large populations without creating the inequalities that eventually undermine social cohesion, are recurring features of the human experience with large-scale social organization. The third reason Cahokia matters is one that it shares with all great mysteries. It reminds us of the limits of our knowledge and the importance of intellectual humility. We have been studying Cahokia with the full toolkit of modern archaeology for several decades, and we still cannot answer with certainty the most basic questions about the city's history. Who was the paramount chief at the height of the city's power? What specific events triggered the Big Bang? Was there a moment, a specific turning point, when the trajectory of the city shifted from expansion to decline? What did the people who left think they were leaving for? What stories did they tell about the city they had abandoned? These questions may never be answerable. The past has preserved the mounds and the artifacts and the bones, but it has not preserved the inner lives of the people who made them. This is what makes Cahokia, in some profound sense, a meditation on the nature of history itself. We have the monuments, but not the meanings the builders gave them. We have the bodies, but not the names of the dead. We have the remnants of a city that was once full of human voices and human arguments and human love and human ambition. And the voices are gone so completely that all we have left is the shape of the hole they left behind. Sitting with that absence, taking it seriously rather than filling it too quickly with confident interpretations, is one of the most important things that the study of a place like Cahokia can teach us. The mounds of the American bottom stand today in a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition from the one that the Cahokians knew. Interstate highways run through the floodplain. Suburban subdivisions cover the land where Cahokia's satellite communities once stood. The river itself, confined by levees and its flow regulated by dams, no longer floods the bottomland in the way it once did. And the wetland habitats that made the American bottom such an extraordinarily productive ecosystem have been largely replaced by agricultural fields and urban infrastructure. Monk's Mound rises incongruously from the middle of a state historic site, surrounded by strip malls and fast food restaurants. The ancient monument and the modern landscape in a juxtaposition that is initially jarring and eventually, if you sit with it long enough, profoundly eloquent. The people who built Monk's Mound could not have imagined this future. They could not have imagined that the continent they inhabited would be overrun by people from across the ocean, that their city would be abandoned and forgotten, and then rediscovered by people who initially refused to believe that the indigenous people of the continent could have built such things, that their descendants would survive centuries of catastrophe and displacement and continued marginalization, and would still be here, still insisting on the importance and the complexity and the humanity of what their ancestors built. The descendants of the Cahokians, whoever they are, whoever can legitimately claim that connection, have inherited a past that is more remarkable and more worthy of serious attention than most of the popular history of North America acknowledges. There is something in the story of Cahokia that speaks specifically to this moment in history, a moment when the sustainability of large-scale human organization is itself one of the central questions of the age. The Cahokians built something extraordinary and then watched it fail under the combined weight of environmental degradation, social inequality, political fragmentation, and ideological exhaustion. They did not choose these outcomes. They were navigating a situation of growing complexity with the tools and the knowledge available to them, and those tools and that knowledge were not equal to the challenges that the situation eventually presented. This is not a story about the inevitable failure of human ambition. It is a story about the conditions under which human ambition can succeed and the conditions under which it cannot. And those conditions include the health of the natural environment, the fairness of the social arrangements that distribute the benefits of collective effort, the credibility of the ideologies that justify the demands made of ordinary people, and the adaptability of the political institutions that manage the society's responses to stress. These are not ancient lessons in the dismissive sense of things that only apply to people long dead. They are perennial lessons, the recurring pattern of the human experiment with large-scale social organization. Cahokia failed, but it also succeeded, spectacularly, for longer than most of the political entities of the contemporary world have yet existed. Something extraordinary was built in the American bottom between roughly 1050 and 1200 CE. Something that drew the energy and the labor and the faith of tens of thousands of people. Something that expressed the full range of human capability in a form that still commands our respect and our wonder, even after 700 years of neglect and misunderstanding and partial destruction. The Cahokia paradox, as we have called it throughout this story, is not simply the paradox of a great city that nobody remembers. It is the deeper paradox at the heart of all human civilization. The fact that the same qualities that make us capable of building something extraordinary, our ability to organize collective effort, to maintain shared belief, to produce far more than we as individuals need, and to direct that surplus toward ambitious common projects, are also the qualities that make us capable of overextending ourselves, of exhausting the natural systems that support us, of creating inequalities that eventually tear apart the social fabric, of building institutions whose rigidity prevents the adaptation that changing circumstances demand. Cahokia is a mirror, and what it shows us when we look into it carefully is ourselves, in all our remarkable and fragile complexity. The field in Illinois is quiet tonight. The mounds stand in the dark, indifferent to the highways that border them, and the city lights that glow on the horizon, and the planes that pass overhead, tracing their way between the continental cities that have replaced the great earthen city that once stood here. The grass on the slopes of Monk's Mound moves in the night wind, coming off the river. The flat plain of the Grand Plaza is still and dark. There is a stillness here that is different from ordinary quietness. The specific stillness of a place where something immense once happened and then stopped, where the sound of a city's life, the accumulated noise of tens of thousands of people going about their days, rose for 2 centuries and then faded over the course of another 2 centuries until there was nothing left but the wind and the grass and the great earthen monuments that have outlasted everything else. Whatever questions we cannot answer about Cahokia, one thing seems clear. The people who built those mounds knew, in some way that may not have required explicit articulation, that they were building something that was meant to last. The pyramid builders of every civilization have always understood that Earth lasts, that a mound of well-placed, well-compacted soil, built carefully and maintained conscientiously, can outlast the people who built it by centuries, by millennia, by geological ages, if necessary. The Cahokians could not have known that their city would empty out within 2 centuries of its founding, but they built their monuments as if they meant to be permanent, as if the things they were expressing through those millions of basket loads of earth were true in a way that deserved to be said in the most durable medium available. And in a strange way, they were right. The people are gone. The city is gone. The language is gone. The rituals are gone. The names of the chiefs and the priests and the ordinary farmers and craftspeople are gone, dissolved into time without a trace. But the mounds remain. They are still here, still rising from the floodplain of the Mississippi River in the heart of the continent, still expressing something about the human impulse to build, to organize, to reach toward the sky with deliberate purpose. They are still, in their patient, massive, earthen way, telling the story of what happened here, waiting for us to learn to listen well enough to hear it fully. Rest well tonight, and if you find yourself, in some quiet hour, thinking about the people who built those mounds, the farmers and the priests and the children playing in the Grand Plaza and the craftspeople bent over their work in the workshops, and the traders arriving by canoe from 1,000 miles away, and the paramount chief standing on the summit of Monk's Mound, watching the sun rise over the horizon of the continent, know that thinking about them, taking them seriously, remembering that they were here, is itself a way of honoring something that deserves to be honored. The Cahokians built a civilization that the world forgot and that the world is only now beginning to remember. And they deserve to be remembered. All of them, each of them, every last one. Let us return to the city at its height, because we have not yet spent enough time there. The mounds and the plazas and the archaeological theories are necessary, but they are not the same as the experience of being inside Cahokia, of understanding what it was like to live in the most important city on a continent. To do that, we need to go further into the texture of daily life, into the rhythms of the seasons, and the sounds of the workshops, and the smells of the kitchens, and the complicated social reality of a place where 10,000 or 20,000 people were trying to share a limited space and make it work. A day in Cahokia, in the year 1100 CE, would have begun before dawn. The city was not the kind of place where people could afford to sleep late, not for most of its residents. The agricultural cycle that sustained the city demanded constant labor in the fields during the growing season, and the maintenance of the city's infrastructure demanded labor year-round. The working population of Cahokia, the farmers and the craftspeople and the porters and the builders, would have been on their feet with the first light, responding to the rhythms of a world in which artificial light was expensive and natural light was free. The sound of the city waking up would have been distinctive, familiar to anyone who has ever been in a pre-industrial town or village where everyone is doing essentially the same thing at the same time. The sound of fires being stoked, of kindling catching, of the first smoke of morning rising from the smoke holes of hundreds of houses in the residential districts. The sound of grinding, the rhythmic thud of stone on stone as women and some men processed the dried corn that was the foundation of the morning meal. The sound of children being roused, the particular sounds of very young children before they have fully woken up. The sound of dogs, which were present in abundance in Mississippian communities and served both as working animals and as a food source in times of scarcity. And underneath all of this, the sound of the river, the ever-present background hiss and murmur of the Mississippi flowing past a few miles to the west. The morning meal in a typical Cahokia household would have been simple by the standards of what the city's agricultural productivity could theoretically produce. Corn was prepared in many ways in the Mississippian world, pounded into flour and made into a kind of bread baked on hot stones, simmered with water into a thick gruel, dried and popped over fire, fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage that served as much as a food source as a drink. The corn might be supplemented by dried beans, another key agricultural staple that provided the protein complement to the mostly carbohydrate diet of corn, or by dried vegetables or preserved fish, or smoked meat, depending on what the season and the household's resources allowed. The elite households of the city's inner precinct ate better, ate more varied diets, ate more meat and more high-quality foods in greater abundance. This was both a practical difference in nutrition and a symbolic marker of status, the visible expression in bodily form of the social distance between those who controlled the city's resources and those who produced them. After the morning meal, the working day began in earnest. For the farmers, the nature of the work varied dramatically with the season. Spring planting was an intensive period of concentrated effort, when the fields had to be prepared and the corn planted at the right depth, in the right spacing, before the window of the planting season closed. The preparation of the floodplain fields was hard physical labor, breaking the dense bottomland soil with digging sticks and hoes made of bison scapula, the broad shoulder bones of the bison that were traded into Cahokia from the plains communities to the west. The planting itself was done by hand, each seed placed individually in a prepared hole, a task that required care and knowledge, and the kind of attention to detail that distinguishes a skilled farmer from someone who is merely going through the motions. The summer was a period of maintenance and vigilance, weeding the corn as it grew, managing the beans and squash that were often grown alongside the corn in the traditional interplanted system of the eastern woodlands, watching for the pests and the storms that could damage or destroy what was growing. The summer was also the season when the river was most likely to flood, and when the crops were most vulnerable to the combination of drought and heat that could wilt a season's work in a matter of weeks. The farmers who worked the fields around Cahokia were not passive observers of the weather, but active managers of a complex agricultural system, making constant decisions about irrigation from the backwater lakes and channels, about the protection of vulnerable plants, about the allocation of labor between different tasks. The autumn harvest was the culmination of the agricultural year, the season when everything that had been planted and tended and protected came to fruition, or did not. A good harvest meant security, meant full storage pits, and the comfortable knowledge that the winter could be survived without privation. A poor harvest meant calculating how to make less go further, which households could spare what, how to redistribute the available food in ways that kept enough people healthy enough to get through the winter and plant again in spring. The organization of the harvest and the storage of its products was not a purely household affair in Cahokia. It was a matter of community and political management, because the surplus that went into the central redistribution system that fed the non-agricultural specialists of the city's core came from the harvest, and the mechanisms for collecting that surplus, for moving it from the farms to the central storage facilities, were political mechanisms operating at the level of the whole community. The winter was a season of a different kind of work. Agricultural labor slowed as the fields lay fallow and the stored food was carefully rationed through the cold months. But winter was the season for other kinds of productivity. Craft production could continue through the winter, regardless of the weather. Pottery making, though limited by the necessity of drying the clay in conditions that were not too cold and not too wet, could be done inside. The weaving of fibre into cloth and cordage, the manufacture of stone tools by knappers working from their stores of raw material, the carving of bone and shell into ornaments and ceremonial objects, the maintenance and repair of the tools and structures that had been worn by a season of heavy use. All of this happened in the winter months when the agricultural demands were lightest. The winter was also the season of storytelling, of the oral transmission of the knowledge and the histories and the beliefs that made Cahokia what it was. In a society without writing, the winter months, when people were gathered close around their fires, provided the time and the conditions for the transmission of the cultural knowledge that would otherwise be lost with each generation. The elders told stories, the children listened, the myths of the cosmic order and the deeds of the supernatural beings that populated the Mississippian universe and the histories of the community and its ancestors were all transmitted in this way, from mouth to ear in the firelit interior of houses, where the cold outside made the warmth within feel like a gift. The specialists of Cahokia, the people who did not work primarily as farmers, occupied a social position that was both privileged and precarious. The craftspeople who produced the prestige goods that circulated through the city's elite exchange networks were skilled workers whose expertise gave them a certain status, but they were dependent on the elite for the raw materials they worked with and for access to the distribution networks that gave their products value. A copper engraver in Cahokia needed both the copper that came from 1,000 miles to the north and the access to the paramount chief's ritual network that made copper objects worth producing. Both of these dependencies gave the elite leverage over the craftspeople that defined the limits of their autonomy. The religious specialists occupied an even more ambiguous position. The priests and the diviners and the astronomical observers who maintained the ritual calendar and performed the ceremonies that, in the Mississippian worldview, kept the cosmos in order, were powerful people in the sense that their knowledge and their ritual authority were genuine sources of social influence. But they were also, in a very real sense, servants of the chief, because the chief's authority rested partly on his control of the ritual system, and the ritual specialists, whose knowledge and performance made the system work, were therefore both his allies and his dependents. The relationship between political and religious authority in Cahokia, as in every early complex society, was one of mutual dependence and potential conflict, with each needing the other, but neither entirely comfortable with the arrangement. The women of Cahokia present a particular challenge to our archaeological understanding, partly because the material evidence tends to be weighted toward the kinds of activities that preserve well in the archaeological record, and partly because the early scholarship on Cahokia, like much of the early scholarship on archaeology in general, tended to be conducted by men whose assumptions about gender roles shaped what they looked for and what they saw. More recent feminist archaeology has worked to recover the lives and the contributions of women at the site, and the picture that emerges is of women who were, as in most societies, central to the reproduction of the community in both the biological and the cultural sense, and who occupied a range of social positions, from the most marginalized to the genuinely powerful. The women sacrificed in Mound 72 remind us of the most extreme form of female vulnerability in Cahokia's social system, the way in which women's bodies could be claimed by the ritual demands of the paramount chief in a manner that had no equivalent for men. But the women who managed the households, who processed the corn and made the pottery and wove the cloth and raised the children and maintained the social networks that held neighborhoods together, were also essential to the city's functioning in ways that the surviving material evidence if read carefully, makes clear. And there were almost certainly women who occupied positions of genuine authority in the city's religious and possibly political system, though the evidence for this is more fragmentary. The children of Cahokia grew up in a world that was, by any reasonable measure, more complex and more stimulating than the world of the pre-urban communities from which many of their parents had come. The city was a place of genuine information density, where people from different places with different knowledge and different skills lived in close proximity and interacted constantly. A child growing up in Cahokia had access to a wider range of experiences, ideas, and models of what a human life could look like than a child growing up in a small farming village in the hinterland. The city was educational in the most basic sense, a place where learning happened by proximity and by observation and by participation in a social world of genuine complexity. But the city was also a more dangerous place for children than the hinterland, in the specific sense of biological danger. The disease environment of Cahokia was considerably more threatening than that of the smaller, more dispersed communities of the countryside. In a large urban centre, the pathogens that cause infectious disease have more hosts available to them, spread more easily from person to person, and maintain themselves in the population at endemic levels, rather than burning through and dying out as they would in smaller communities. The skeletal evidence from Cahokia's cemeteries shows elevated rates of childhood pathology compared to contemporaneous rural sites, including bone lesions associated with anemia and infections, and elevated rates of growth disruption visible as lines of arrested bone growth that were caused by serious illness during childhood. Growing up in Cahokia was not necessarily healthy in the way that the romantic image of indigenous life in North America sometimes implies. The foreign-born residents of Cahokia, the people who had come from distant places to participate in the city's opportunities, occupied a particularly interesting position in the social fabric. Their presence is demonstrated by the strontium isotope analysis of skeletal remains, which can detect the difference between the strontium signature of local soil and water and the signatures of soils and waters in other geographic regions, and which has shown clearly that a significant fraction of the people buried at Cahokia spent their childhoods elsewhere. Some of these migrants came from relatively nearby, from the hinterland communities of the American bottom and the surrounding uplands, but others show strontium signatures that are consistent with origins considerably further away, suggesting that people were being drawn to Cahokia from remarkable distances. Why did they come? The same reasons that have always drawn people from smaller places to larger ones. The city offered economic opportunities that were not available in the countryside. The concentration of craft production and trade meant that someone with a skill could find a market for it in Cahokia that simply did not exist in a small village. The religious significance of the city meant that people came on pilgrimage, some of them staying when they found the place worth staying for. The political authority of the paramount chief drew people who wanted to be close to power, to participate in the networks of patronage and alliance that radiated from the city's centre, and perhaps some of them came simply because the city was there, because the human impulse to move toward a centre of human activity, to be part of something larger than any individual or any household, was as present in the pre-Columbian American bottom as it has been in every place and every time where cities have existed. The relationship between Cahokia and its hinterland was not simply one of centre and periphery, of urban core extracting resources from rural producers. It was more complex and more reciprocal than that. The smaller communities of the American bottom and the surrounding uplands that were drawn into Cahokia's orbit were not merely colonies or tributaries. They were participants in a system that offered them things in return for what it extracted. Access to the prestige goods that marked status in the Mississippian world, participation in the ritual life of the paramount center, protection under the political umbrella of the paramount chief's authority, access to the trade networks that the city anchored. The relationship was unequal, certainly, weighted in favor of the center and its elite. But it was also a relationship of genuine exchange, and the communities of the hinterland had reasons to participate in it beyond mere coercion. One of the most revealing aspects of the relationship between Cahokia and its hinterland is the pattern of what archaeologists call Ramey-incised pottery. a distinctive ceramic style associated with the city that has been found at sites scattered across a huge geographic area in the 11th and 12th centuries. Ramean-sized pots, with their characteristic incised designs of swirling circles and scrolls, appear at sites from Wisconsin in the north to Arkansas in the south, and from Iowa in the west to Kentucky in the east. They were not necessarily produced at Cahokia itself, though some of them were. They were produced by people who had access to the Cahokia style, who were participating in, or at least imitating, the cultural tradition that the city represented. The distribution of Ramean-sized pottery is a material trace of the influence that Cahokia exercised across the Mississippian world, a kind of consumer goods version of the political and ideological connections that radiated from the city's center. The question of how Cahokia's influence was transmitted across this huge geographic area is one that continues to occupy archaeologists. The traditional model saw the spread of Mississippian material culture as primarily a matter of elite exchange, of prestige goods and ritual knowledge, moving through hierarchical networks of chiefs and their subordinates. More recent models have emphasized the role of migration, arguing that significant numbers of Cahokia's people actually moved into other regions, carrying their material culture and their ideas with them. And some scholars have emphasized the role of what they call peer polity interaction, the process by which neighboring complex societies influence one another through competition and emulation rather than through hierarchical transmission. All of these mechanisms were probably operating simultaneously, and the result was the distinctive Mississippian tradition that covered the eastern half of the continent in the 11th and 12th centuries. The fall of Cahokia did not happen in isolation. It was accompanied by, and may have contributed to, a broader reorganization of the Mississippian world in the 13th and 14th centuries. Other major Mississippian centers also experienced contraction or relocation during this period, suggesting that the forces that brought Cahokia down were not entirely local. The climate instability of the 13th century affected the entire region. The population movements, triggered by Cahokia's decline, rippled outward into the hinterland, creating new pressures on communities that were already navigating the stresses of the period. The reorganization of trade networks, as Cahokia's centrality diminished, created new patterns of exchange that advantaged different communities and disadvantaged others. What emerged from this period of reorganization was a different Mississippian world, one that was in many respects less centralized than the world Cahokia had anchored. The major Mississippian centers of the 14th and 15th centuries, sites like Moundville in Alabama and Spiro in Oklahoma, and the towns of the Caddo area of Texas and Louisiana, were impressive and complex in their own right, but did not achieve the continental dominance that Cahokia had exercised at its height. The Mississippian tradition continued to evolve and to produce remarkable cultural achievements, but the specific experiment that Cahokia represented, the attempt to create a single dominant urban center in the heart of the continent, was not repeated. The water management challenges facing Cahokia were, in retrospect, some of the most serious long-term problems the city confronted, and they are among the aspects of the site's archaeology that have received the most careful attention in recent decades. The American bottom, for all its agricultural richness, was a landscape defined by water in ways that were both advantageous and deeply challenging. The backwater lakes and wetlands that provided fish and waterfowl and fresh water were also the source of flooding events that could be catastrophic. The rivers that made the region a continental hub for trade also rose and fell with a variability that required constant management and adjustment. And the groundwater table in the floodplain was high enough that the digging of large structures like borrow pits and house foundations brought moisture to the surface in ways that created ongoing problems with stability and drainage. Cahokia's elite managed these water challenges with a sophistication that is only now beginning to be fully appreciated. Recent work using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies has revealed evidence of ancient channels and earthen berms within the Cahokia site that appear to have been deliberately constructed or modified to direct the flow of water across the floodplain in ways that, protected the most important parts of the city from flooding while channeling water toward the agricultural fields where it was needed. The scale of this water management infrastructure, while not as dramatic as the Great Mounds, was in many ways an equally impressive engineering achievement, requiring the same kind of coordinated labor and the same kind of planning over long time horizons that the mound construction demanded. The borrow pits from which the earth for the mounds was excavated became, over time, significant landscape features in their own right. As the mounds grew, the pits grew deeper, eventually becoming permanent water features, artificial lakes that persisted on the Cahokia landscape for generations. Archaeological evidence suggests that these borrow pit lakes were not merely accidental byproducts of the mound construction, but were integrated into the landscape design of the city in deliberate ways. Some of them appear to have served as reservoirs, holding water during the dry season for use in the adjacent agricultural fields. Others may have served as fish ponds, managed bodies of water that could be harvested for protein in a predictable and controllable way, and at least some of them appear to have had ritual significance, their water surfaces serving as reflective mirrors that played a role in the cosmological symbolism of the ceremonial center. The Grand Plaza itself, that great flat expanse of carefully maintained open ground at the heart of the city, was a water management achievement as much as it was an architectural one. The floodplain soil naturally develops slight irregularities over time, as settling and erosion and biological activity create subtle variations in surface level. Maintaining the plaza as a genuinely flat surface required constant attention, the periodic addition of fresh clay to low spots, and the scraping of high areas to maintain the smooth, level surface that was required for its ritual and possibly athletic functions. The drainage of rainwater from the plaza was also a challenge, since a surface of packed clay could accumulate standing water during heavy rains in ways that would make it unusable for days at a time. The slight gradient of the plaza surface, which appears to have been built with a careful attention to drainage in mind, suggests that the people who designed and maintained it understood these challenges and had developed practical engineering solutions to address them. The specific mounds of Cahokia, beyond the magnificent Monk's Mound, each have their own stories to tell, and taken together, they constitute a kind of three-dimensional text in which the city's history and its cosmological framework are written in earth. Mound 51, sometimes called the Round Top Mound, is one of the largest conical mounds at the site, and appears to have been associated with burial activity in a way that distinguishes it from the platform mounds that supported residences and temples. The burials found in and around conical mounds at Cahokia and other Mississippian sites tend to be more elaborate than the burials in the general residential districts, suggesting that the conical mounds were specifically reserved for the commemoration of important individuals whose deaths required public monumental marking. Mound 34, positioned to the south of Monk's Mound and now substantially damaged by modern construction, was excavated in the mid-20th century and yielded evidence of a large copper workshop, a place where raw copper, obtained through the Northern Trade Network, was processed into the sheets and ornaments that served as some of the most important prestige goods in the Mississippian world. The presence of a major craft workshop in such close proximity to the central ceremonial precinct suggests that the production of prestige goods was not merely an economic activity, but a ritual one, that the transformation of raw materials from distant places into the symbols of Mississippian authority was itself a sacred act that needed to happen in proximity to the sacred center of the city. Mound 72, which we have already discussed in the context of the dramatic burials it contained, was unusual in its orientation and its form. A ridgetop mound aligned on a southeast-northwest axis that corresponds to the directions of sunrise at the summer and winter solstices. The alignment of Mound 72 with the solar calendar is another expression of the astronomical knowledge that pervades the design of Cahokia, the understanding that the movements of celestial bodies were not merely natural phenomena, but the visible expression of the cosmic order that the city's rituals were designed to maintain. The Woodhenge post circles, 4 of which have been identified at the Cahokia site through careful excavation, are among the most fascinating features of the site's archaeology, precisely because they reveal a dimension of Cahokian knowledge that is easy to underestimate. The circles consist of large wooden posts set into carefully prepared post holes, arranged in circles that range from about 200 to nearly 400 feet in diameter. The posts were substantial, likely a foot or more in diameter, and tall enough to serve as sighting poles for astronomical observation. Analysis of the largest circle, which contained 48 posts, has revealed that specific posts were positioned to mark the points on the horizon where the sun rises on the summer solstice, the winter solstice, the spring equinox, and the autumn equinox. This is not coincidence. The deliberate alignment of the Woodhenge posts with the solar calendar required sustained and careful observation of the sun's movements over the course of at least a full year, and probably over many years, before the correct positions could be established. The people who designed and built the Woodhenge were empirical scientists in the most basic sense, people who observed the natural world systematically and drew conclusions from their observations that they then expressed in built form. The knowledge embedded in the Woodhenge was not merely astronomical knowledge in the technical sense. It was the knowledge that the entire agricultural system depended on, the knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest, when to begin the preparations for the great ceremonies that marked the turning points of the year, when to expect the return of migratory birds and the running of fish in the rivers. The connection between astronomical knowledge and agricultural success was not metaphorical in the Mississippian world. It was literal. The timing of planting, which determined how much of the growing season each crop would have before the autumn frosts, was a practical matter on which the food security of the entire community depended. Getting the timing right, year after year, in a climate that was variable enough to make simple rules of thumb unreliable, required exactly the kind of careful astronomical observation that the Woodhenge was designed to support. The priests who maintained the Woodhenge and made the observations that calibrated the agricultural calendar were not engaging in superstition. They were doing the practical work that kept the city fed. The artifacts recovered from Cahokia's various excavations constitute an extraordinary window into the material culture of a civilization that left no written records. The range of objects found at the site, in its mounds, its middens, its residential areas, and its special purpose deposits, speaks to the full complexity of Cahokian life in ways that complement and extend the information available from the site's structures and spatial organization. The pottery of Cahokia is among the most studied and most revealing of the material categories. The shell-tempered pottery that characterizes the Mississippian tradition was a genuine technological innovation, using finely crushed freshwater mussel shell as the tempering agent that prevented ceramic vessels from shattering when fired. This technology spread across the eastern woodlands along with the Mississippian cultural tradition, and the pottery produced by Cahokia's craftspeople represents some of its finest expressions. The range of forms includes large storage jars, cooking vessels, serving bowls, and the distinctive effigy pots and water bottles that served ritual functions. The surface treatments range from simple smoothing to elaborate incised and engraved decorations that carry the iconographic vocabulary of the Mississippian belief system. The stone tools of Cahokia speak to the city's position at the center of a continental trade network. The finest chert tools found at the site were made from materials that came from specific quarries at considerable distances, some from the Burlington chert outcrops of Missouri, others from the Cobden-Dongola chert sources of southern Illinois, others from more distant sources. The concentration of fine-grained chert at Cahokia reflects both the city's ability to attract materials through its trade networks and the presence of skilled knappers who could turn raw material into the blades and projectile, points, and specialized tools that were used in craft, production, and in the performance of specific ritual activities. The copper objects of Cahokia, both the raw copper and the finished ornaments and tools recovered from the site's high-status burials and special deposits, represent one of the most visually striking categories of Mississippian material culture. Mississippian copper work was produced by cold hammering native copper into thin sheets that were then cut and embossed and rolled and folded into a variety of forms. The most elaborately worked pieces are the so-called copper plates, large sheets of copper embossed with images of the Birdman and other important Mississippian supernatural figures, which appear in elite burials across the eastern half of the continent and served as the most prestigious of all personal ornaments. A copper plate buried with an important person at Cahokia or at one of the site's pier polities said, unmistakably, that its owner was connected to the most powerful network of prestige exchange on the continent. The shell artifacts of Cahokia similarly speak to connections that extended to the edges of the continent. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast appear in various forms, as raw material cut into beads and gorgets, as complete conch shells used as ritual vessels, as the columella, the central spiral of the conch, which was worked into pendants and other ornaments of considerable value. The presence of Gulf Coast shell at Cahokia is archaeological evidence for a trade connection of more than 1,000 miles, a connection that required either the movement of traders over vast distances or the existence of a chain of exchange relationships through which goods moved from community to community across the continent. The animal bones recovered from Cahokia's refuse deposits and special contexts reveal the diversity of the fauna that the city's residents consumed and worked with. White-tailed deer was the most important large game animal, present in abundance in the archaeological record and representing the primary source of non-aquatic mammalian protein in the diet. But the bone assemblages also include substantial quantities of fish, particularly catfish and drum from the river, and large quantities of the bones of waterfowl, particularly ducks and geese, that were hunted in the wetlands and lakes of the American bottom during their seasonal migrations. The freshwater mussels that were gathered from the shallows of the river and its backwaters appear in enormous quantities in the midden deposits of residential areas, their shells forming dense accumulations that speak to the central role of this resource in the city's diet. The faunal evidence also reveals that Cahokia's residents had access to animals from distant regions through their trade networks. Remains of animals that are not native to the American bottom appear occasionally in the archaeological record, including the bones of large birds, like the sandhill crane, that may have been brought to the city dead or alive for ritual purposes, and objects made from the teeth and claws of animals like bears and mountain lions that could only have come from some distance away. The elite of Cahokia consumed power and prestige in every form, including the physical remains of powerful animals that carried symbolic associations with the supernatural forces the elite claimed to mediate. The question of Cahokia's relationship to its satellite communities, the smaller Mississippian towns and villages that existed in the American bottom and the surrounding uplands, and that were in various ways economically and politically dependent on the city, is one that has received considerable attention in recent research. The relationship was not uniform. Some satellite communities appear to have been relatively autonomous, maintaining their own ritual traditions and their own local political structures while participating in the larger network centered on Cahokia. Others appear to have been more tightly integrated into the city's political and economic system, their production organized to feed into the redistributive mechanisms of the paramount center. And others still appear to have occupied a more ambiguous position, participating in Cahokian culture as expressed in their material culture while maintaining a degree of social and political independence. The most recent detailed study of Cahokia's satellite communities has paid particular attention to what happens to them as the city declines. The evidence suggests that the contraction of Cahokia's population in the 13th century was not accompanied by a simple dispersal of its residents into the immediately surrounding countryside. Instead, some areas of the American bottom show evidence of increased population density during the period of Cahokia's decline, suggesting that people were moving out of the city but staying in the region rather than dispersing more widely. Other areas show evidence of abandonment that mirrors the abandonment of the city itself, suggesting that the entire American bottom system was undergoing a reorganization rather than a simple relocation of population. Understanding this regional pattern of reorganization is crucial for understanding what the abandonment of Cahokia actually meant for the people who lived through it. It was not, for most of them, the end of the world in any literal sense. The world they had known, the world of Mississippian culture, with its mounds and its ceremonial life and its trade connections and its seasonal rhythms, continued in modified form after Cahokia's central role in it was gone. They adapted, as human beings always do, finding ways to maintain what they valued while adjusting to the changed circumstances that the city's decline imposed. But the loss of Cahokia as a center of gravity for the Mississippian world was, in retrospect, a genuine historical turning point. The concentration of cultural production, of religious authority, of economic exchange, and of political power that the city had represented was not simply reassembled somewhere else at a comparable scale. The decentralized Mississippian world that emerged after Cahokia's decline was a real and complex world, capable of producing remarkable cultural achievements, but it was a different kind of world from the one that Cahokia had anchored. Something was lost when the city emptied, something that cannot be fully recovered by any archaeology, however patient or sophisticated. The feeling of what it was to live at the center of a continental civilization, the texture of daily life in the most important place on a continent, the experience of being part of something whose scale exceeded anything that any individual could fully comprehend. That experience, the experience of urbanism, of being a member of a large, complex, cosmopolitan community, is an experience that shapes human consciousness in ways that are not easily replicated in smaller settings. The people who grew up in Cahokia, who took its scale and its complexity for granted because it was simply the world they knew, would have experienced the dispersal from the city as a diminishment, even if the individual circumstances of their new lives were in some ways better. The world would have seemed quieter, slower, less dense with information and possibility. The trade goods would have been harder to come by. The ceremonies would have been smaller. The buildings would have been lower, and the spaces more intimate, and the social world more limited in its variety and its stimulation. The city, for all its problems, would have been missed. This is perhaps the most human dimension of the Cahokia story, and it is one that rarely makes it into the formal archaeological literature, which is necessarily cautious about inferring emotional states from material evidence. But it is not speculation to say that the people who lived through Cahokia's decline experienced it as a loss. Loss is what abandonment is. The people left because they had to, or chose to, but the place they left was a place that had shaped who they were, and its absence would have been felt. There is a particular kind of historical vertigo that comes from thinking carefully about the relationship between Cahokia and the indigenous nations that European explorers and colonizers encountered in the Mississippi River Valley. Centuries after the city's abandonment, the French explorers who paddled down the Mississippi in the 1670s and 1680s, men like Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet and René Robert Cavelier de la Salle, entered a landscape that bore the physical traces of a civilization far more complex than anything they expected to find in the interior of the continent. The great mounds were visible to them, standing in the floodplain as undeniable evidence of human construction and human ambition on a scale that could not be dismissed. But the people they encountered, the various Algonquian and Siouan-speaking nations that inhabited the region, did not claim the mounds as their own heritage. The connection between the living people and the ancient monuments was not, at the moment of European contact, a connection that the people themselves articulated. This disconnect has been interpreted in different ways by different scholars. The simplest interpretation is that the ancestors of the people the French encountered were not the builders of the mounds, that the population of the region had turned over in the 2 centuries between Cahokia's abandonment and the arrival of European observers. This interpretation would explain the disconnection between the people and the monuments, but raises its own questions about who the Cahokians were and where they went. A more complex interpretation holds that the connection was real, but had been obscured by the catastrophic disruptions of the period between Cahokia's decline and European contact, including the population displacement caused by the continued reorganization of the Mississippian world, and eventually the devastating effects of European disease, which reached the interior of the continent ahead of European observers and may have transformed the regional population before anyone from the outside world was present to observe. The question of indigenous connections to Cahokia is not merely an academic matter. It is a question with real significance for the contemporary indigenous nations of the region, for their relationships to the land, and to their own historical identities. Several contemporary nations have asserted cultural or ancestral connections to Cahokia, including the Osage Nation, the Quapaw Nation, and various communities that trace their histories to the Oneota culture that succeeded the Mississippian tradition in parts of the upper Midwest. These claims are taken seriously by the Illinois State Historic Preservation Office and by the federal agencies that oversee the management of the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site under the terms of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the federal law that requires institutions to consult with and return ancestral remains to descendant communities. The process of repatriation at Cahokia has been complicated and sometimes contentious, partly because the question of cultural affiliation, of which contemporary nation is most legitimately the descendant of the Cahokian people, is genuinely difficult to answer on the basis of the available archaeological and historical evidence, and partly because the interests of different contemporary nations are not always aligned. But the process itself, the requirement to consult with indigenous communities about the management and the interpretation of a site that is genuinely part of their history, however that history is traced, is an important acknowledgement of the fact that Cahokia is not merely an object of academic curiosity, but a living piece of the heritage of real contemporary people. Contemporary indigenous scholars and community members have brought perspectives to the interpretation of Cahokia that complement and sometimes challenge the interpretations of academic archaeology. One area where indigenous perspectives have been particularly valuable is in the interpretation of the site's cosmological dimensions, where the knowledge traditions of contemporary Mississippian-descended nations, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, and others of the Southeast, preserve elements of a worldview that shares important features with the cosmological framework that the Cahokian material record appears to express. When Choctaw scholars speak about the significance of mounds in their own cultural tradition as ceremonial spaces and as expressions of the relationship between the human community and the forces of the cosmos, they are drawing on a living tradition that may illuminate aspects of Cahokia's meaning that the purely material evidence cannot reveal. The broader political context in which Cahokia is studied and interpreted also matters. The United States is a country with a deep and troubled relationship to its indigenous history, a country in which the acknowledgement of the sophistication and complexity of pre-Columbian civilization has historically been resisted because it complicates the narratives that justified European settlement. The rediscovery of Cahokia, the insistence by archaeologists that a major pre-Columbian city existed in the heart of what would become the United States, is not merely an academic correction to an academic error. It is a political act in the most basic sense, an insistence that the history of the continent before European arrival is real and complex and worthy of serious attention, and that the people who built Cahokia deserve to have their achievement recognized as part of the human story. This recognition has been slow in coming. The site remains, by most measures, dramatically underappreciated relative to its historical and archaeological significance. The number of annual visitors to Cahokia Mound State Historic Site is a small fraction of the number who visit comparable sites of ancient civilization in other parts of the world, or indeed comparable sites of European-derived heritage in the United States itself. Part of this is a matter of location and infrastructure. The site is not in a major tourist destination, but part of it reflects the deeper problem of an American historical consciousness that has not yet fully incorporated the pre-Columbian past as a living, important, relevant part of its own story. What would change if it did? What would be different about the way Americans understood themselves and their relationship to the land they inhabit if Cahokia were as well known as Gettysburg? If Monk's Mound were as familiar an image as the Lincoln Memorial? If the name Cahokia evoked in most people's minds the same sense of historical weight that other place names associated with important events in American history evoke? The honest answer is that it is impossible to know with certainty but the direction of the change seems clear. A historical consciousness that includes Cahokia is one that recognizes the continent as having a long and complex human history before European arrival, one that sees the indigenous people of North America not as a static backdrop to the main story of European colonization, but as the inheritors of genuine civilizational traditions that were disrupted by that colonization. It is a historical consciousness that might be more humble about the uniqueness of its own civilizational achievements, more aware of the recurring patterns that connect the history of one civilization to the history of others, more sensitive to the ways in which complex societies can overextend themselves and fail to adapt to changing circumstances. These are not merely interesting historical lessons. They are relevant to the present moment in ways that are not difficult to identify. We live in an era of multiple, intersecting civilizational stresses. Climate change that is altering the conditions under which agriculture and urban life are possible. Social inequalities that are generating political tensions and eroding institutional legitimacy. Technological and economic changes that are disrupting the arrangements through which large populations have organized themselves for generations. And a crisis of shared belief, a weakening of the ideological consensus that had held certain forms of political and social organization together. These stresses are different in their specific content from the stresses that brought down Cahokia, but they rhyme with them in ways that are worth noticing. The historical record of complex societies under stress is not comforting reading. Complex societies under stress tend to respond in ways that make things worse rather than better. They concentrate power rather than distributing it. They extract more from the natural and social systems that support them rather than reducing their demands. They respond to declining legitimacy with more elaborate claims to authority rather than with the reforms that might restore genuine legitimacy. They prioritize the maintenance of existing arrangements over the adaptations that the situation requires. The archaeology of Cahokia's decline shows all of these patterns. The rebuilding of the defensive palisade rather than the reform of the social arrangements that were generating internal conflict. The continued extraction of labor and tribute from an increasingly stressed agricultural base rather than the reduction of the city's demands on the landscape. The attempt to maintain the ideological legitimacy of the paramount chief through ever more elaborate ritual performance, even as the practical outcomes that legitimacy depended on were failing. None of this is to suggest that the people of Cahokia were failures or that they could have easily done better. They were navigating an extremely difficult situation with the knowledge and the tools available to them, and the outcomes they experienced were the result of a long chain of decisions and circumstances that no individual or group of individuals fully controlled. But the patterns they fell into are recognizable, and the recognition matters, because recognizing a pattern is the first step toward potentially doing something different. The city in the field, the mounds in the suburb, the Great Pyramid that nobody visits, rising from the floodplain of the Mississippi River while the cars speed past on the interstate and the shoppers fill the parking lots of the strip malls that surround it. This is the current state of the Cahokia paradox, and it is perhaps the most eloquent statement of what the city's story is trying to tell us. The greatest pre-Columbian city, north of Mexico, sits in the middle of the most powerful country on Earth, almost completely unknown to the citizens of that country. Its significance unacknowledged by the culture that has built itself on and around the land where it once stood. The Mounds are patient. They have been waiting for 700 years, and they can wait longer. But the question they are waiting to have answered is one that deserves an answer sooner rather than later. What does it mean to have inherited a landscape with this kind of history, and what are the obligations that inheritance creates? The people of Cahokia did not think of themselves as participants in a story that would interest scholars 7 centuries after their city emptied. They thought of themselves as people living their lives, navigating their days, loving their children, performing their rituals, pursuing their ambitions, enduring their hardships. They were human, in every sense of the word, with all the complexity and the contradictions and the beauty and the darkness that human life contains. The paramounts who demanded the sacrifice of young women in their burial mounds were human. The farmers who carried basket loads of earth to build those mounds were human. The craftspeople who shaped copper into the faces of the birdman were human. The children who played along the edges of the Grand Plaza were human. The priests who climbed Monk's Mound at the solstice to make their observations of the horizon were human. They are gone. Their city is gone. Their language is gone. Their music is gone. Their jokes are gone. Their grief is gone. Their moments of unexpected joy are gone. What remains is the shape they pressed into the earth, the mounds that encode 7 centuries of silence and waiting, the artifacts that preserve the outline of their material world without the warmth that animated it, and the soil itself, layered with the traces of generations of human activity, patient and dark, and full of things we have not yet found and may never find. Let the mounds stand as they are. Let them be what they are, a monument not only to the ambition of the people who built them, but to the limits of human ambition, to the way that the most extraordinary achievements are always built on foundations that are more fragile than the achievement makes them appear. Cahokia rose because a specific confluence of geography and climate and agricultural technology and ideological energy created conditions that were, for a brief and extraordinary period, exactly right for the emergence of a great city. It declined because those conditions changed, and the city's institutions were not equal to the change. This is a story that has been told before, in Egypt and in Mesopotamia and in the Indus Valley and in the Maya lowlands and in Imperial Rome and in dozens of other places where human ambition built something extraordinary and then watched it fall. And it is a story that is still being told every day in every complex society on Earth that is trying to navigate a world that is changing faster than its institutions can adapt. Cahokia does not tell us that cities always fall, or that ambition always fails, or that the human project of building something larger than any individual is inherently doomed. What it tells us is that everything that has been built can be unmade, that the conditions that made something possible can change, that the people who come after us will look at what we have built and try to understand it, and that their understanding will be, like ours of Cahokia, partial and incomplete, and always reaching towards something that the evidence alone cannot fully provide. Sleep well tonight. Somewhere in the quiet dark of the American Midwest, the mounds stand in the night wind off the Mississippi River, patient and enormous and full of the human past. They have been waiting for us to pay attention, and now, for a little while at least, we have. The Cahokia paradox remains. The greatest city that pre-Columbian North America produced rose faster than any city of its era, had a right to flourish, with a brilliance and a reach that touched a continent, and then went quiet in the span of a human lifetime, leaving behind mounds that outlasted the memory of the people who built them, and the civilization that gave them meaning. We know more now than we did when modern archaeology began to study the site in earnest. We know the rough shape of the story, the timeline of the rise and the decline, the environmental pressures and the social tensions and the political fragilities that contributed to the fall. We know the artifacts and the architecture and the bones. We know, approximately, who the Cahokians were and where they came from and what they ate and how they organized their society. But we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the name of the greatest chief. We do not know the words to the ceremonies performed on the summit of Monk's Mound at the winter solstice. We do not know the songs that the women sang when they ground the corn on cold mornings. We do not know the stories they told their children about the great beings who inhabited the upper world and the underworld. We do not know what they feared most, or what they loved best, or what they said to each other in the last days, when it was becoming clear that the city was emptying and would not be refilled. This not knowing is not merely a scholarly limitation. It is a reminder of the depth of the past and the limits of what any evidence can reveal. The mounds preserve the shape of an ambition that we can admire from the outside without ever fully inhabiting. The people of Cahokia lived lives as real and as internally complex as any lives being lived anywhere on Earth today, and those lives are gone as completely as if they had never existed, except for the shape they pressed into the earth. The shape is enough to tell us that something remarkable happened here. It is not quite enough to tell us what it meant to the people who made it happen. That gap between the shape and the meaning, between the evidence and the experience, between the archive and the life it once contained, is where history lives. It is the space we are always reaching across, always trying to close, never quite succeeding. Cahokia lives in that gap, enormous and patient, waiting for us to ask better questions, to look more carefully, to listen more attentively to what the earth is trying to tell us about the people who once pressed their lives into its surface and then walked away into a future that neither they nor we can fully see. The field is quiet now, the mounds endure, and somewhere, in the layered silence of that earth, the story of Cahokia is still being written, one careful excavation at a time, one patient laboratory analysis at a time, one thoughtful conversation between scholars and indigenous community members at a time, as the slow work of understanding accumulates against the vast weight of what we do not yet know. We are getting closer. We will not arrive, but the reaching matters, and it is enough. Rest well. We should spend more time with the specific researchers who have devoted their careers to understanding this place, because their work is part of the story of Cahokia too, a story about how the knowledge of a vanished civilization is slowly reconstructed from fragments. The archaeology of Cahokia has attracted some of the most dedicated and creative minds in North American archaeology over the past half-century, and their individual contributions have accumulated into a collective understanding that would have been impossible to imagine when the first systematic excavations began in the mid-20th century. Warren Whittree was one of the first archaeologists to recognize the significance of the post circles at Cahokia, which he described in a landmark 1964 paper that introduced the term woodhenge to the archaeological literature. Whittree's work was important not only for what it revealed about Cahokia's astronomical knowledge, but for what it implied about the organizational sophistication of the people who had constructed the post circles. The placement of posts with sufficient precision to mark solar alignments across distances of several hundred feet required both careful measurement and the kind of coordinated labor that could only have been organized by people with real authority over substantial numbers of workers. Whittree's woodhenge was a reminder that the mounds were not the only expression of Cahokia's organizational ambitions. Melvin Fowler's excavations at Mound 72 in the late 1960s and early 1970s produced evidence that transformed the scholarly understanding of Cahokia's social structure and its ritual life. The discovery of the beaded burial, with its extraordinary deposit of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon, and the surrounding sacrificial burials, forced a fundamental revision of the picture of pre-Columbian North American society that had prevailed in much of the popular and even the scholarly literature up to that point. Fowler's work demonstrated that Cahokia had been a place of genuine social hierarchy and genuine political authority, a place where the paramount chief could command the deaths of hundreds of people to accompany his burial. This was not, in other words, a simple tribal society. It was something considerably more complex, and Fowler's excavations made that complexity impossible to ignore. James Anderson's long career at the Cahokia site contributed systematic survey work that established the full extent of the archaeological landscape, revealing that the mounds that were visible above ground were only a fraction of the features that the site contained. Anderson's surveys, using surface collection and early remote sensing techniques, identified hundreds of previously unrecorded features, including the remains of structures, middens, and prepared surfaces that extended the known boundaries of the site considerably beyond what had been recognized before his work. The picture of Cahokia that his surveys contributed to was one of a genuinely urban landscape, dense with human activity across a large and continuous area. Timothy Porketat's contributions to Cahokia archaeology span several decades and several major interpretive frameworks. His 1,994 doctoral dissertation, subsequently published as The Ascent of Chiefs, presented a systematic analysis of the social transformation that accompanied the Cahokia Big Bang, arguing that the rapid emergence of the city represented not a gradual evolutionary development, but a genuine political revolution, a deliberate and rapid reorganization of the social landscape around a new political center. His later book, Ancient Cahokia, and the Mississippians, published in 2004, synthesized the state of knowledge about the site for a general audience in a way that made the extraordinary complexity of Cahokia's history accessible to readers outside the specialist literature. And his continued research on the site and its regional context has produced a series of papers and books that have kept pushing the boundaries of our understanding of what Cahokia was and what it meant. Sarah Baers is among the more recent generation of Cahokia scholars whose work has focused particularly on the spatial organization of the city's ceremonial precinct and on the ways in which the built environment of the site expressed and reinforced the cosmological framework that underpinned Mississippian authority. Her analysis of the spatial relationships between the mounds, the plazas, and the post circles has revealed a level of geometric and astronomical intentionality in the site's design that had not been previously fully appreciated, suggesting that the people who laid out Cahokia were working from a sophisticated spatial plan that integrated astronomical knowledge, cosmological symbolism, and practical considerations of traffic flow and visibility into a unified urban design. The isotopic studies that have been conducted on skeletal remains from Cahokia and the surrounding region have been led by a number of researchers whose work has fundamentally changed our understanding of who the Cahokians were. The application of strontium, oxygen, and carbon isotope analysis to the bones and teeth of Cahokia's dead has revealed the geographic origins of the population, the dietary patterns of different social groups, and the ways in which those patterns changed over the course of the city's history. This work has confirmed that Cahokia was genuinely cosmopolitan, drawing people from a wide geographic area, and that the dietary inequality between elites and commoners was real and substantial. The environmental research that has been conducted in the American Bottom region has drawn on an equally impressive array of methodologies. Pollen cores extracted from the silted-up borrow pits and backwater lakes of the floodplain have provided a continuous record of vegetation change across the Cahokia period, allowing researchers to track the deforestation of the uplands and the changes in the composition of the floodplain vegetation that accompanied the city's growth and decline. Phytolith studies, which analyze the microscopic silica bodies that plants produce and that preserve in the soil after the plant has decomposed, have allowed researchers to reconstruct the vegetation of the Grand Plaza and other open spaces with a precision that would have been impossible with pollen alone. Sediment core analysis from the lakes and wetlands of the region has provided records of flooding episodes, erosion events, and changes in water quality that illuminate the hydrological history of the landscape during the Cahokia period. All of this research, conducted by dozens of individual scholars over decades of patient work, has produced a picture of Cahokia that is far richer and more nuanced than anything that was available to the general public or even to most scholars a generation ago. And the research continues, because the questions that Cahokia poses are not exhausted. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the past decade have revealed the presence of extensive subsurface features in areas of the site that have not yet been excavated, suggesting that significant information remains to be recovered from the portions of the site that have not been destroyed by modern development. LiDAR surveys of the surrounding landscape have identified additional mound sites and landscape features that extend the known extent of the Cahokia urban system, filling in the picture of the hinterland communities and their relationships to the city centre. Ongoing paleogenomic research on the DNA preserved in the skeletal remains of Cahokia's population promises to reveal information about the genetic relationships within the population and between the Cahokians and other pre-Columbian populations that will complement and extend the isotopic evidence. The story of Cahokia is not over. It will not be over as long as there are researchers asking questions and soil to be analysed and bones to be studied and remote sensing data to be interpreted. The vanished city continues to yield its secrets, one careful study at a time, and the picture that emerges is always more complicated and more interesting than the one that came before. Beyond Cahokia itself, the broader Mississippian world that the city dominated and influenced contains its own extraordinary sites that deserve attention as part of the larger story. Moundville, in what is now Alabama, was one of the most important Mississippian centers of the 13th and 14th centuries, a time when Cahokia was declining and Moundville was reaching its own peak of complexity. The site contains 29 mounds arranged around a large central plaza, organized in a spatial pattern that reflects the same cosmological principles we see at Cahokia. The paramount chief's mound at the center, the other mounds arranged hierarchically around it. The plaza as the public ceremonial space that mediated between the sacred central precinct and the residential community beyond. Moundville's elaborate mortuary program, with its striking ceramic vessels and copper ornaments and carved stone objects, represents some of the finest artistic production of the entire Mississippian tradition, and the site has been the subject of decades of careful archaeological research that has made it one of the best understood of all Mississippian centers. The Spiro site, in what is now eastern Oklahoma, occupied a position at the western edge of the Mississippian world, a crossroads where the agricultural societies of the eastern woodlands met the mixed farming and hunting societies of the southern plains. The cache of objects found in the Great Mortuary Mound at Spiro in the 1930s and early 1940s, before adequate archaeological controls were in place, was one of the most spectacular collections of Mississippian ritual material ever encountered, including engraved shell cups of extraordinary artistry, copper plates embossed with the figures of the Mississippian supernatural world, and a range of other prestige objects that speak to the site's position at the center of an important regional trade network. The looting of Spiro by treasure hunters in the years before archaeologists took control of the site resulted in the dispersal of much of this material into private collections, one of the great losses in the history of North American archaeology. The Etowah site in northwestern Georgia represents another major Mississippian center that was active over roughly the same period as Cahokia, though it reached its peak somewhat later and persisted into the period of European contact. The site contains 3 major platform mounds arranged around a central plaza, with the largest mound, Mound A, rising to a height of about 60 feet and covering roughly 3 acres at its base. The marble statues found in the principal burial mound at Etowah, 2 remarkable figures of a man and a woman rendered in careful naturalistic detail, are among the most extraordinary works of art produced in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico, and they speak to the same cosmological traditions and the same emphasis on the personal authority of the chiefly body that we see expressed at Cahokia in different but related ways. The Cahokia influence was felt even at considerable distances from the American bottom, in communities that adopted elements of the Mississippian tradition without necessarily being within the direct political orbit of the city. The Aztalan site, in what is now Wisconsin, a northern outpost of Mississippian culture that was established sometime in the 11th or 12th century, is particularly striking because it demonstrates how far the Cahokia cultural influence could reach and how completely it could be absorbed into communities that were quite different in their underlying social organization from the communities of the American bottom. Aztalan contains platform mounds, a palisade wall with bastions very similar to those at Cahokia, and artifacts that reflect clear connections to the Mississippian ceramic and symbolic traditions. It was, in a real sense, Cahokia, in miniature, an expression of the city's cultural reach, transplanted into a northern landscape where the conditions for the full development of the Mississippian urban tradition did not exist. The Angel Mound site, in what is now southwestern Indiana, was a major Mississippian center, active during the period from roughly 1100 to 1450 CE, overlapping with both the height of Cahokia and its subsequent decline. Angel Mounds sits on a high bluff overlooking the Ohio River, in a position that gave it access to the trade networks of both the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi system. The site's 11 mounds include both platform mounds and a large burial mound, and the central plaza is surrounded by the remains of thousands of structures that housed a population estimated at several thousand people. Angel Mounds provides an important window into the way that the Mississippian tradition was expressed in a regional center outside the American bottom, showing both the similarities that reflect the shared cultural tradition and the differences that reflect local conditions and local political arrangements. All of these sites, and the dozens of smaller Mississippian sites that punctuate the eastern half of the continent, were part of the world that Cahokia defined and dominated. They were the nodes of a network that the city had created or consolidated or absorbed, each of them participating in the continental system of exchange and influence and ideological transmission that Cahokia anchored, and each of them, in the 13th and 14th centuries, was navigating the same combination of environmental stress and political reorganization that Cahokia itself was experiencing, the same set of pressures that were transforming the Mississippian world from the centralized, Cahokia-dominated system of the 11th and 12th centuries into the more decentralized, regionally varied system that the Spanish explorers encountered in the 16th century. The encounter between the Mississippian world and the first European explorers was, as we have noted, catastrophic in ways that went far beyond the immediate military confrontations. The pathogens that European expeditions carried with them, primarily the smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases for which the indigenous populations had no immunity, spread through the interconnected networks of the Mississippian world with a speed and a mortality rate that modern observers can barely comprehend. Population estimates for the pre-Columbian Southeast Range widely, but even conservative estimates suggest a population decline of 50% or more in the century, following first European contact, with some communities experiencing losses of 80 or 90%. The social and political consequences of this biological catastrophe were enormous, involving the collapse of leadership structures, the abandonment of settlements, the displacement of surviving populations, and the dissolution of the long-distance exchange networks that had sustained the political and economic systems of the Mississippian world. The Mississippian chiefdoms that De Soto encountered in the 1540s, already weakened by decades of epidemic disease, spread ahead of the Spanish by the network connections that had once been one of the Mississippian world's greatest assets, were, in many cases, shadows of what they had been a generation earlier. By the time the first English colonists arrived to establish permanent settlements on the Atlantic coast in the early 17th century, the transformation was even more complete. The complex, politically centralized Mississippian societies that had dominated the interior of the continent for centuries had given way to smaller, more dispersed, less politically complex communities, the descendants of once great civilizations, navigating the catastrophic aftermath of a biological event for which no human society could have been prepared. This trajectory, from Cahokia's height in the 11th century, through the city's decline in the 13th and 14th centuries, through the continued Mississippian tradition in modified form to the catastrophic disruption of European contact in the 16th century, is a story of the full range of what human civilizations face in their historical existences. Internal dynamics of growth and stress and institutional failure, environmental pressures that exceed the capacity of existing adaptive strategies, the sudden eruption of external forces that transform the conditions of existence in ways that no amount of internal adjustment can address. Cahokia itself was gone before the worst of this last catastrophe struck, but the civilization it had founded, in modified and decentralized form, was present for the reckoning. What we take from all of this, sitting here in the present, much as we might spend a quiet evening thinking about a place and a people who vanished 7 centuries ago, is ultimately a matter of what we choose to take from it. History does not hand us lessons in the way that fables do, with clear morals attached and unambiguous heroes and villains. It gives us stories, complicated and partial, and always open to interpretation, and it asks us to sit with them and see what they reveal about the human condition in its full complexity. The story of Cahokia reveals a civilization that was extraordinary in its ambition and its achievement, that pressed the limits of what was possible given its technology and its environment and its social organization, and that ultimately could not sustain itself against the combined weight of the stresses it faced. This is a human story, not a uniquely indigenous story, or a uniquely American story, or a uniquely pre-modern story. It is the story of what happens when human beings try to build something larger than any individual can encompass, something that requires the cooperation of thousands or tens of thousands of people over generations, something that is always more fragile than it appears from the outside, because it depends on conditions, both environmental and social and ideological, that are always subject to change. The mounds of the American bottom stand in the night, as they have stood for 1,000 years, patient monuments to an ambition that reached further than it could finally sustain, to a people who built something extraordinary and then watched it come apart, to the perennial human condition of reaching beyond what we can hold, and then learning, again, the limits of our grasp. They do not judge us, they do not warn us, in any direct or legible way. They simply stand, enormous and patient and full of silence, waiting for us to ask the questions that the past is always ready to answer, if we are willing to listen carefully enough and long enough to hear what it has to say. The great city is gone, the mounds remain, and the Mississippi River flows past in the darkness, indifferent to everything, carrying the continent's water to the Gulf of Mexico as it has for 10,000 years, before Cahokia and after Cahokia, before us and after us. The permanent fact of the landscape against which all our temporary ambitions play out their brief and brilliant courses. On the surface of the water in the darkness, the starlight breaks into moving fragments, and the fragments look, almost, for a moment, like the lights of a city seen from above, 1,000 small fires spread across the darkness of a continent, alive and flickering, and briefly, beautifully there. Rest now. The story is told, as much of it as we can tell. The rest belongs to the silence. The silence around the mounds is not empty. It is a specific kind of silence, the kind that exists in places where something has ended, and the ending has had centuries to settle into the landscape. You can feel it when you walk across the grass at the base of Monk's Mound on a quiet morning before the visitors arrive. That particular quality of stillness, that is not the absence of sound, so much as the presence of a very long pause. The birds still sing, the wind still moves. The highway in the distance is a continuous low murmur, but underneath all of this, or perhaps woven through it, there is something that resists easy description, a quality of the place that makes you want to speak quietly and move slowly, and pay attention in a way that ordinary landscapes do not demand. This quality is not supernatural. It does not require a belief in ghosts or in the persistence of spiritual energy in sacred places. It is something altogether more interesting than that, because it is real, and it is produced by entirely physical and historical causes. The mounds are physically imposing in a way that affects how you experience the landscape, their mass altering the geometry of the horizon and the play of light in ways that your body registers before your conscious mind has had a chance to form an opinion about what you are seeing. And the historical knowledge of what the place was, of the tens of thousands of people who lived here, and the extraordinary society they built, and the way it all eventually dispersed into the wider world, gives everything you see a weight of significance that ordinary landscapes do not carry. The visitors who come to Cahokia Mounds on a summer weekend come from many different places and many different backgrounds, and they bring very different frameworks for understanding what they are looking at. Some come as history enthusiasts, people who have read about the site and want to see it in person, who can place what they are seeing within the context of what they know about pre-Columbian North America, and who experience the place with the engaged curiosity of someone whose interest has been prepared by prior knowledge. Some come as families on an educational outing, parents who want their children to understand that North America has a deep human history that predates European arrival, who are themselves seeing Monk's Mound for the first time and processing their own surprise at its scale. Some come as descendants of indigenous nations, with connections to the region, people for whom the site carries a personal and sometimes emotional significance that goes beyond academic interest, who are standing on ground that is part of their own story, in a way that is different from standing on ground that is merely historically significant. All of these visitors are doing something important by being there, by making the choice to engage with this particular piece of the human past, rather than with one of the endless other available entertainments and distractions. The act of visiting a place like Cahokia, of standing in the presence of the physical evidence of a civilization that most people do not know about, is itself a form of learning that no book or documentary can fully replicate. The scale of Monk's Mound is not something you can fully grasp from a photograph or a description. You need to stand at its base and look up at the long slope rising to the summit against the sky, and feel in your body the weight of the effort that went into creating that slope before you can begin to appreciate what it meant for the people who built it and the people who lived in its shadow. The ongoing debate among archaeologists about many aspects of Cahokia's history is itself one of the most interesting things about the site, because it reveals how much genuine uncertainty remains in our understanding of even the basic facts. The population estimates for the city at its height range from about 10,000 to perhaps 20,000 in the urban core, with the uncertainty reflecting genuine disagreement about the density of settlement and the extent of the occupied area, rather than mere imprecision in the calculations. The dating of the Big Bang, the rapid transformation that created the city from a cluster of villages, is generally placed somewhere between 1050 and 1100 CE. But the resolution of the radiocarbon dating that underlies this estimate is not sufficient to determine whether the transformation happened over 10 years or 50 years. The causes of the decline are disputed, with different scholars emphasizing different factors and weighing the available evidence differently, and no consensus has emerged that all specialists would accept. This ongoing uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is the normal condition of any field that is trying to understand the past from fragmentary evidence, and it is actually one of the things that makes Cahokia such a rich subject for continued inquiry. The questions that remain unanswered are not trivial questions that a bit more excavation will easily resolve. They are deep questions about human social organization and its limits, about the relationship between environment and civilization, about the role of belief and ideology in maintaining social cohesion, about the conditions under which urban life becomes possible and the conditions under which it becomes impossible. These questions matter for understanding Cahokia, and they also matter for understanding the human condition more broadly, which is why Cahokia continues to attract the attention of scholars from many different disciplines, not only archaeologists but also historians, anthropologists, ecologists, climatologists, and specialists in comparative civilizational studies. There is a world, parallel to ours, in which Cahokia did not decline, in which the climate remained favorable and the agricultural system remained productive, and the political institutions adapted to the stresses they faced, and the ideology maintained its credibility through generations of adequate harvests and manageable floods. We cannot know what that world would have looked like, whether the city would have continued to grow or would have stabilized at a sustainable size, or would have reorganized itself into a different kind of political entity as the pressures of scale made the original chieftaincy model unworkable. We cannot know whether that world would have produced a written script, whether it would have developed more sophisticated metallurgical techniques, whether it would have built a network of roads connecting the interior of the continent in the way that the Roman road system connected the Mediterranean world. We cannot know what the encounter between that world and the European world of the 16th century would have looked like, whether the Mississippian civilization of an alternate North America would have had the demographic density and the political organization to resist colonization in ways that the actual Mississippian societies could not. These counterfactual speculations are not idle fantasy. They serve a purpose, which is to remind us that the world we inhabit is not the only world that was possible, that the history we know is one path through a space of many possible paths, and that the choices and the chance events and the structural constraints that determined which path was actually taken are worthy of careful study precisely because they were not inevitable. Cahokia did not have to fail. It failed for specific reasons in specific circumstances, and understanding those reasons and those circumstances is the work of the archaeologists and historians and ecologists and climate scientists and community members who are still, patiently and carefully, trying to understand what happened in the American bottom between 1,000 years ago and 700 years ago. The field in Illinois waits in the dark. The mounds are patient. The Mississippi carries the continent's water south in the night. And somewhere, in the layered soil of the American bottom, under the grass and the highways and the parking lots and the strip malls and the fields. The evidence of what was and what might have been lies waiting for the next question and the next careful answer, and the slow accumulation of understanding, that is what the study of the human past, at its best, can offer us. Not certainty, not simple lessons, but the richer and more demanding gift of complexity, of seeing the full humanity of people who lived before us, in all its achievement and all its fragility.